We like to think that we are in complete control of our lives. We make plans, we set goals, and we follow a routine day after day, expecting everything to go exactly the way we want it to. But the truth is, we are all just one random event away from having our entire world turned completely upside down. Sometimes these events are incredibly terrifying. Other times they seem like complete accidents of fate. But every once in a while, something happens that is so wild, so incredibly unlikely, that if you saw it in a movie, you would probably shake your head and say there is no way that could ever happen in real life. Today, I am going to tell you 3 stories about real people who had something totally unexpected and insane happen to them. These are stories of survival, of passion, and of resilience in the face of absolute disaster. These are the kinds of stories that are truly stranger than fiction. These events did not just change their lives in an instant, but in some of these cases, they went on to change the lives of millions of other people all around the world. We will explore how their choices shaped their paths. These stories are a slight departure from what we normally do on this channel, but they still have that same mysterious, gripping feeling that keeps you wondering what is going to happen next. So, if you enjoy these types of narratives, let me know in the comments and we will definitely do more of them. But before we dive into these incredible events, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, delivered in a straightforward storytelling format, then you have definitely come to the right place, because that is exactly what we do here, and we upload new episodes once a week. If that sounds like something you would enjoy, please go ahead and put glitter inside the like buttons, car vents, so that the very next time they turn on their air conditioning, they get a giant, sparkling surprise blown all over the inside of their car. Also, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on all notifications so you never miss any of our weekly stories. Now, let us get right into today's first story. It was the afternoon of the 9th of July, 2001. A 13-year-old boy named Cody Clausen was walking through a dense stretch of woods near Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming. Cody was carrying a heavy bag of camping supplies, and his shoulders were starting to ache from the weight. He had come out to these rugged woods for a weekend camping trip with his father and the rest of his local Boy Scout troop. About 30 minutes earlier, Cody had decided to break off from the main group. They were all set up at their primary campsite, but Cody realized they had left some very important gear back in his father's truck. Since the truck was parked a couple of miles away, Cody volunteered to hike back alone to grab the extra supplies. He made it to the truck without any issues, loaded up his bag, and turned right back around to head back to camp. As Cody hiked along the dirt path, he let his mind wander. He was not really paying attention to his surroundings. Instead, he was daydreaming about the campfire that night. He was trying to come up with the perfect spooky story to tell the other scouts to impress them and show them how tough he was. But as he kept walking and thinking, a strange feeling started to creep over him. He stopped walking and looked around. He realized that the trees and the rocks did not look familiar at all. He had been walking for quite a long time, and by his calculations, he should have reached the campsite by now. At first, Cody did not panic. He was a Boy Scout, after all. He told himself that he must have just taken a wrong turn somewhere when he was lost in thought. He figured the smartest thing to do would be to simply retrace his steps, head back to his father's truck, and start the hike over again. That way, he would at least know exactly where he was, even if he ended up being really late getting back to the camp. But as he turned around and started walking, he quickly realized he had no idea which way he had come from. The forest was thick, and because he had not been paying attention, he had drifted far off the main trail. Within minutes, Cody knew he was completely lost, and a cold wave of panic began to settle in his chest. Hours went by. Cody walked frantically through the dense wilderness, desperately calling out for his father or anyone else who might hear him. But the only sound returning to him was the rustling of the leaves in the wind. To make matters worse, as the afternoon started to fade into evening, the sky began to turn a dark, angry purple. Huge storm clouds were rolling over the mountains. Cody knew that a cold night in the Yellowstone wilderness during a storm could easily become life-threatening. But he tried to stay positive. He told himself that his dad and the scout leaders definitely knew he was missing by now. They were probably already setting up a massive search party to find him. But Cody also knew that the wilderness was vast, and it could take them hours or even days to locate him. The thought of spending days out here alone was absolutely terrifying. He took a deep breath, calmed his heart rate down, and decided to rely on his scout training. He needed to build a shelter, find some food and water, and make a fire to keep warm until help arrived. He found a relatively flat spot beneath a tree, sat down, and dumped the contents of his heavy supply bag onto the dirt. But when he looked at what he had brought from the truck, his stomach dropped. None of the items were going to help him survive. There was no gear for building a shelter, no matches to light a fire, no food, and only a tiny bottle of water that was already almost empty. He essentially had nothing. Right at that moment, the sky opened up and a violent thunderstorm began. Cold rain and heavy hail started pounding down through the tree canopy. Lightning flashed, and thunder shook the ground beneath his feet. Terrified and freezing, Cody shoved what he could back into his bag, stood up, and just started running blindly through the dark forest, desperate to find any kind of cover. Then, a massive bolt of lightning illuminated the entire area for a split second. In that brief flash, Cody saw the dark opening of a cave right ahead of him. He scrambled over the wet rocks, threw himself inside the cave, and curled up on the hard, dry ground. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, Cody was shivering and crying. He was so overwhelmed by fear and physical exhaustion that his brain simply shut down. He closed his eyes and drifted off into a deep sleep, wondering if he would ever see his family again. The next morning, Cody woke up and crawled to the mouth of the cave. The storm had finally passed, and the sun was beginning to peek through the trees. But before he could even think about what to do next, he heard a faint, distant chopping sound. It was the unmistakable sound of a helicopter. Cody ran out of the cave into a small clearing and looked up. Sure enough, there was a small helicopter flying low over the tree lines, scanning the area. Cody knew he had to act fast before the helicopter flew away. He remembered a trick from his Boy Scout survival manual. He quickly unbuckled his belt, held up the shiny metal buckle, and angled it toward the sun, trying to reflect the bright sunlight directly at the helicopter cockpit. It worked perfectly. The helicopter suddenly tilted, turned in his direction, and began to hover directly above him. The pilot waved through the glass and started looking for a clearing nearby to land the aircraft. Cody was so overwhelmed with joy that he grabbed his bag and ran as fast as he could toward the clearing where the helicopter was descending. He watched as the skids touched down on the grass. Cody did not wait. He ran up to the passenger side, threw the door open, and climbed inside. The pilot turned to him, looked him in the eye, and calmly said, "Good morning." Cody was in such a state of shock and relief that he could barely speak. But when he actually looked at the face of the man who had just saved his life, his jaw dropped. He could not believe who was sitting in the pilot's seat. It turned out that the night before, when Cody did not return, his father had immediately contacted the local authorities. A massive search and rescue operation was launched, and several volunteers from the surrounding area offered to help. One of those volunteers was an amateur helicopter pilot who happened to live nearby and wanted to assist in the search. That pilot had flown 10 miles away from the original campsite to find Cody. And that pilot was none other than Harrison Ford, the legendary actor who played Han Solo in Star Wars and Indiana Jones. When Harrison Ford flew Cody back to the search headquarters and reunited him with his father, his dad assumed Cody would want to go straight home to recover from the trauma. But Cody looked at his dad and said that he wanted to go right back to the Boy Scout camp. He wanted to sit around the campfire and tell the other scouts exactly what had happened to him, because he now had a campfire story that absolutely none of them would ever believe. Now, let us move on to our second story, which takes us across the Atlantic Ocean and back in time to September of 1954. A 14-year-old boy named Rich was slowly shuffling his way down the long, sterile hallway of a children's hospital in England. Rich was incredibly weak, and he coughed and wheezed with almost every single step he took. He was walking alongside several other sick children, and they were all heading toward a small classroom located inside the hospital. Rich did not know what kind of lesson they were going to have that day, and honestly, he did not really care. Anything was better than sitting alone in his cramped hospital room, staring at the walls and being bored out of his mind. Rich was in the hospital because he was suffering from tuberculosis, an infectious lung disease. Over the previous 10 weeks, he had been transferred to several different hospitals as doctors tried to treat his condition. In fact, his illness was so severe that the medical staff had recently sat his parents down and told them that Rich might have to remain hospitalized for up to 2 more years. This was a nightmare for a young boy, but unfortunately, being stuck in a hospital was nothing new to Rich. When he was just 6 years old, his appendix had burst, leading to a massive internal infection that put him into a coma for several weeks. After waking up from the coma, he had to spend nearly an entire year in a hospital bed just to recover from the ordeal. All of these prolonged hospital stays had a devastating impact on Rich's life, especially when it came to his education. He had fallen incredibly far behind in his schoolwork. Because his family was very poor and lived in a tough working-class neighborhood, they could never afford to hire a private tutor to help him catch up. As a result, Rich's entire education consisted of whatever random basic classes the various hospitals happened to offer. Sometimes a teacher would come in to teach them how to weave baskets or maybe how to do basic woodworking. It was not much of an education, but it was all he had. So, on that afternoon in 1954, when Rich walked into the hospital classroom, he had incredibly low expectations. He assumed it would be another boring activity just to pass the time. But the moment he stepped through the door, his eyes lit up. Sitting at the front of the room was a visiting music teacher, and scattered all around the teacher were various musical instruments. Ever since he was a little boy, Rich had dreamed of playing the drums. He remembered walking past a music store window years ago, staring at a beautiful drum set and wishing more than anything that he could play it. But his family could never afford such a luxury. Now, looking at the instruments in the classroom, Rich realized this might be his only chance. When the teacher started handing out instruments to the children, Rich did not wait. He marched right up and demanded the drum. He told the teacher he would not play anything else. The teacher smiled and handed him a simple snare drum and a pair of wooden sticks. That day, the teacher tried to lead the room of sick children through a few simple songs. The resulting noise was absolutely terrible. None of the kids knew what they were doing, and the music was objectively awful. But to Rich, it was the most beautiful thing he had ever experienced. By the time the class ended, he felt completely energized. He had not suddenly become a master drummer in 1 hour, but he had discovered a massive, burning passion for the instrument. He decided right then and there that since he was going to be trapped in this hospital for the foreseeable future, he was going to spend every single second practicing. The very next day, Rich snuck into a hospital utility closet and found some long wooden sticks that the nurses normally used for knitting. Those became his makeshift drumsticks. For the next year and a half, Rich used those knitting needles to beat a rhythm onto every single surface he could find. He drummed on his bedside table, he drummed on the metal radiator, he drummed on his own knees, and he drummed on the floor. Every few weeks, when the music teacher returned to the hospital, Rich would be the first one in the classroom, eager to learn anything he could. In 1955, at the age of 16, Rich was finally released from the hospital. He was completely cured of tuberculosis. But even though he had his health back, his life did not suddenly become easy. His family was still deeply in debt, and Rich could not afford to go back to school. Instead, he had to immediately get a full-time job working in a local factory to help his family pay the bills. Rich did not complain. He knew it was his duty to help his family, and he accepted his reality. But he never let go of his dream. Even while working long, grueling hours at the factory, he would grab pieces of wood and drum on the machinery during his breaks. He found joy in rhythm whenever and wherever he could. Then, on Christmas of 1956, everything changed. Rich's stepfather had secretly been working extra shifts and saving every spare penny he had for months. On Christmas morning, he surprised Rich with a real, actual drum kit of his own. Rich was so emotional he could barely contain himself. It was the greatest gift he had ever received. He began practicing constantly, and before long, he started playing with small local bands in his spare time. He quickly earned a reputation around town as one of the most talented and reliable drummers in the area. A few years later, a highly popular local band had a sudden falling out with their drummer and fired him. They needed a replacement fast, and since Rich was the best drummer around, they approached him and asked if he would join them. Rich immediately accepted. By that point, Rich had started using a stage name, Ringo Starr. And the band that had just hired him to be their new drummer was none other than the Beatles. Our third story takes us to the morning of Sunday, the 20th of October, 1991. A 31-year-old man named Will woke up next to his wife in their beautiful home in Oakland, California. As soon as Will opened his eyes, he noticed a sharp, pungent smell in the air. It was the smell of wood smoke. Will got out of bed, walked over to the bedroom window, and pulled back the curtains. When he looked out toward the horizon, he saw a massive, thick plume of black smoke rising into the sky just beyond the edge of his neighborhood. Because wildfires are a frequent and dangerous reality in California, Will immediately became concerned. He picked up the phone and dialed 911 to report what he was seeing. But the dispatcher told him that the fire department was already all over it. The dispatcher explained that there had been a wildfire on the nearby mountainside about 600 feet away, but it had already been put out. The smoke he was seeing was simply the leftover remains. Relieved, Will went about his normal morning routine. As he brushed his teeth and took a shower, his mind began to wander toward his work. Will was a software developer, and he was in the middle of working on a video game about ants and how they build their homes. He was really excited about this project, designing the virtual colonies in his head as he got dressed. But when Will looked out the window again, his heart stopped. The small plume of smoke had turned into a massive cloud of black soot, and he could see huge orange flames licking up over the trees. The wind had picked up, and the fire was moving directly toward his neighborhood at an incredibly fast speed. Will immediately called 911 again. He could tell from the dispatcher's voice that they were caught off guard and did not realize the fire had flared back up. Will knew he could not wait for help. He grabbed his wife, packed a few bare necessities, and ran out the front door. The street was filled with chaos and thick smoke. Neighbors were frantically loading their cars and preparing to flee. As they were about to speed away, Will suddenly remembered their next-door neighbors. The couple who lived there had gone away for the weekend, leaving their elderly parents to watch after their 2-year-old child. Because the grandparents did not have a car, they were completely trapped. Will ran over, pounded on their door, and helped the terrified grandparents carry the toddler to his car. He stepped on the gas and drove through the blinding smoke to safety. A week later, Will returned to his neighborhood with a police escort. When he got out of the car, he looked at where his house used to be, and it was completely gone. Every house in the neighborhood was leveled. The Oakland Hills firestorm had burned for 4 days, destroying thousands of homes and killing 25 people. Will walked through the rubble of his home. As he stood there surveying the destruction, he was hit with a powerful wave of clarity. He did not care that he had lost all of his possessions. He was just incredibly grateful that his family and his neighbors had survived. As he looked down at the ash at his feet, he noticed a group of ants. Despite the devastating fire, they had survived underground, and they were already busy gathering supplies and rebuilding their colony. This sight gave Will a brilliant idea. He realized that the game he was making should not just be about ants. It should be about how people survive, adapt, and rebuild after tragedies. 9 years later, Will finally released his new video game. But it was not the original game about ants. Instead, inspired by the resilience of those tiny insects in the ruins of his home, he created a game where players could build digital houses, design neighborhoods, and guide characters through simulated lives. But he kept the game realistic by including unpredictable disasters like fires, showing that no matter what happens, you must move forward and rebuild. The game became a massive global success, selling tens of millions of copies worldwide. Will's full name was Will Wright, and the game he created was The Sims. All three of these incredible stories share a common thread. They show us how fragile our daily lives truly are, and how a single moment can change everything we thought we knew about our future. Whether it is a 13-year-old boy getting lost in the deep wilderness of Yellowstone during a massive storm, or a sick 14-year-old boy facing years of isolation in a hospital bed, or a young software developer watching his entire home turn to ash in a historic firestorm. In each of these situations, it would have been incredibly easy for these individuals to give up. They were facing overwhelming odds, physical danger, and immense emotional pain. But instead of letting despair take over, they kept moving forward, one small step at a time. Cody Clausen relied on his Boy Scout training and kept his calm, leading to a miraculous rescue by one of the most famous Hollywood actors in the world. Richard Starkey found a deep passion for the drums while recovering in a hospital bed, practicing on radiators and tabletops with knitting needles until he eventually became Ringo Starr and joined the most famous rock band in history. And Will Wright watched a resilient colony of ants rebuild in the ruins of his destroyed Oakland home, inspiring him to create a digital universe that would change the entire entertainment industry forever. These stories remind us that life is completely unpredictable, and while we cannot control the disasters that strike us, we can control how we respond to them. The next time you find yourself facing an obstacle that feels completely insurmountable, or a tragedy that seems to tear your world apart, think about these three people. Remember the scout in the cave, the boy with his knitting needles, and the developer watching the ants. They show us that sometimes the worst moments of our lives can lead to the most extraordinary outcomes. We just have to keep moving forward, finding the strength to rebuild, and waiting to see what the next chapter has in store for us. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. We often delude ourselves into believing that we are the masters of this world, that we are in total control of every space, from the familiar comfort of our homes to the colossal machines built by our own hands. Yet, sometimes, it only takes one wrong step, a fleeting moment of negligence, or a series of inexplicable events for the thin veil between our peaceful reality and a deadly abyss to vanish. Today, we will step into places no one was ever meant to enter, forgotten voids, massive industrial giants, and the hidden shadows tucked away in the heart of our bustling cities. 3 individuals, 3 distinct fates, and 3 outcomes so horrific they defy belief. They never knew that the very places they chose to seek refuge or traverse would become the fatal traps that stole their final breath. What makes these stories so haunting is not just the tragedy of their deaths, but the chilling silence that preceded them. As hope faded and their cries for help became nothing more than echoes in the void, they were forced to confront a brutal truth. Sometimes, silence does not mean safety. It simply means that death is standing nearby, waiting for the moment our guard drops. Prepare yourselves, for behind every clue that seems purely coincidental lies a devastating reality waiting to be unraveled. It was the 20th of December 2019, the last day of school before winter break. For one 4-year-old Harley Dilly, it was supposed to be a day of excitement. Instead, he started his morning feeling furious. The night before, he had gotten into a heated argument with his parents, and as a consequence, they had taken away his phone. When Harley did not return home that afternoon, his parents began to worry, but they were initially cautious. Harley had a history of acting out when he was angry. In the past, he had run away to stay with friends or even slept in abandoned buildings nearby. His parents contacted his friends and the school, but no one had seen him after the final bell rang. Assuming he was just blowing off steam, they didn't call the police immediately. By the next day, however, the silence became unbearable. Without his phone, there was no way to reach him. Panic set in, and the family finally contacted the authorities. A formal search was launched, but it quickly hit a wall. There were no leads, no sightings, and no digital footprint. Weeks turned into a month. The family plastered the town with posters, begging their son to come home and assuring him that he wasn't in trouble. The entire community joined the search, scouring the streets and woods, but Harley had seemingly vanished into thin air. The break in the case came almost a month later, thanks to a vacant house directly across the street from the Dilly home. The property was undergoing renovations, so the owners weren't living there, but they had security cameras installed outside. When police reviewed the footage, they found a chilling piece of evidence: Harley walking toward the property on the very day he went missing. The police arrived at the house with the owners, who provided a key. Inside, the home was secure. All doors and windows were locked from the inside, and there was no sign of a forced entry or a struggle. It seemed impossible that anyone could have vanished inside such a contained space. The officers moved systematically from room to room, calling out Harley's name, but their voices were met only with silence. As they reached an upstairs bedroom, they spotted a jacket lying on the floor. It was Harley's, the exact one he had been wearing when he disappeared. Beside it lay a curious metal plate. Looking at the wall nearby, the officers noticed a hole high up that perfectly matched the size of the plate. It was a vent. Their first terrifying thought was that someone else might have been there, that perhaps a criminal had harmed Harley and hidden the evidence inside the walls. One of the officers grabbed a stool and climbed up to peer into the vent. Reaching in, he immediately touched something that stopped his heart. He pulled his hand back, horrified, and confirmed that a person was inside. It was Harley, and he was deceased. The investigation that followed uncovered a heartbreaking reality. The leading theory was that Harley, in a moment of frustration, had climbed onto the roof of the vacant house. Perhaps he was looking for a place to hide, or perhaps he simply wanted a vantage point away from everyone. He found the chimney, which lacked a cap, and looked down. To him, it must have looked like a simple shaft he could descend to reach the interior of the house. He climbed in feet first, unaware that the chimney was designed to be wide at the top and grow progressively narrower as it descended. About halfway down, he became stuck. Realizing the danger, he tried to maneuver. He reached the level of the internal vent, punched the metal plate off, and even took off his heavy jacket, pushing it through the hole in hopes of creating enough space to slip through. It worked, but only for a moment. As he moved further down, he became hopelessly wedged. In a desperate, panicked attempt to make himself thinner, he pulled his arms up over his head. But as he struggled to breathe, the movement caused him to shift lower into the narrowest part of the chimney. Every time he screamed for help, the air escaped his lungs, causing his chest to compress. Because the chimney was so tight, his chest couldn't expand to inhale again. He was trapped in an inescapable mechanical asphyxiation. He couldn't go up, he couldn't go down, and he couldn't take a full breath. He had been so close to his own home, in a place where no one thought to look, and he remained there until the very end. The tragedy left the entire community in mourning, a grim reminder of how quickly a moment of teenage frustration can turn into a life-ending accident. If Harley's death was a costly lesson about silent isolation, then the next story will show that even in the middle of a crowd, the line between life and death can be so fragile that it only takes a single moment of lost control. In the winter of 2002, Lower Manhattan was a bustling, vibrant place, but for 25-year-old Sean Doyle, a friendly and well-liked bartender, a single night out would turn into a scene of unimaginable horror. Sean was a young man described by his regulars as cordial, kind, and easy to be around. He lived in an apartment building not far from his workplace, sharing a home with his sister Shannon and his dog Emmett. Living just down the hall from Sean was his close friend, 47-year-old Michael Wright. Despite their age difference and a massive contrast in physical size, Michael being a much larger, imposing man, the two were best friends who spent a great deal of time together. On the night of the 13th of December 2002, Sean had just finished a demanding double shift at the restaurant. He was tired but ready to unwind and enjoy the weekend. As he returned to his apartment building, he spotted Michael and Michael's girlfriend near the entrance, preparing for a night out. When they waved him over and invited him to join them, Sean didn't hesitate. It was exactly the kind of distraction he needed. He quickly dropped his belongings in his apartment, changed into fresh clothes, and joined the couple. The trio spent the next few hours moving between bars in Lower Manhattan, enjoying the festive energy of the city. By the early hours of December 14, however, the mood began to shift. The alcohol had taken its toll, and they decided it was time to head home. Because their apartment building was only a few blocks away, they opted to walk through the quiet city streets. During the walk, something changed in Michael's demeanor. It remains unclear what exactly triggered his suspicion, but he began to believe that Sean was flirting with his girlfriend. Whatever the perceived slight, Michael became convinced of it, and his reaction was immediate and violent. Without warning, he launched an attack on Sean right there in the middle of the street. Witnesses in the nearby apartment buildings were jarred from their sleep by the sounds of a scuffle. When they looked out their windows, they saw a shocking sight: a much larger man violently beating a smaller one. As the assault continued, Michael shoved Sean with significant force. Sean stumbled backward, losing his balance entirely, and slammed into a plastic chimney cover that sat over a nearby manhole. These structures were commonly used in the city to allow steam from underground lines to escape safely and to prevent people from falling into the maintenance holes. But under the weight of Sean's impact, the plastic cover toppled over, leaving the manhole exposed. Sean fell 18 feet into the darkness of the hole. The moment he landed, witnesses heard a blood-curdling scream that would haunt them for years. The hole was not a dry maintenance shaft. It was filled with boiling water and thick, scalding steam, the result of a nearby steam main leak. Emergency responders and police arrived on the scene quickly, guided by the desperate cries echoing up from the depth. They rushed to the edge of the manhole, hoping to reach in and pull Sean to safety. But the moment they peered down, they were pushed back by a wall of intense, blistering heat. The steam was so dense and the temperature so extreme that even trained professionals couldn't get near the opening. As the steam eventually cleared, they looked down and saw Sean standing in the middle of the hole, the water reaching his waist. He was in an agony that words can barely describe. His back was arched, and he was reaching up, pleading for someone, anyone, to help him get out. The scene was utterly helpless. Police managed to shut off the steam main, and they tried lowering equipment down to him, but Sean's body was already beginning to fail from the sheer physical shock. He was unable to grab onto anything. When they considered sending someone down to strap him into a harness, they realized it was impossible even with the steam main closed. The ambient temperature inside the hole was over 300 degrees Fahrenheit. There was no way to enter the hole without suffering the same fate. For 10 excruciating minutes, the officers, paramedics, and onlookers had to stand around the perimeter of the hole, their heads bowed, forced to listen to Sean's desperate pleas for help as they faded into silence. It would take 4 additional hours for the hole to cool enough for recovery crews to enter and retrieve his body. The tragedy was so profound that Judy Dante, a renowned New York City medical examiner who performed the autopsy, later wrote in her book, Working Stiff, that Sean's death was the single worst she had ever encountered in her career. She noted that Sean's actual cause of death was being steamed alive. Most tragically, she explained that unlike fire, which can destroy nerve endings, severe steam burns do not immediately deaden the senses. This meant that Sean remained conscious and felt every moment of the horrific experience. Michael Wright was eventually charged with second-degree murder, but the memory of that night and the agonizing final minutes of a kind young bartender remains a dark, haunting chapter in the city's history. From Sean's horrifying death in the open streets to Kurt's silent entrapment deep within a steel vessel, the next story reveals that sometimes the most terrifying fate is not chaos, but being completely unheard. In 2003, 27-year-old Kurt Smith was an engineer for the German shipping company Hapag-Lloyd. Having already completed 2 successful 4-month deployments, Kurt was skilled, diligent, and eager to prove his worth. When his contract was extended for a 3rd deployment aboard the container ship CM London Express, he didn't hesitate to take it. He was a professional, comfortable with the grueling, high-pressure environment of a ship's engine room. 3 months into the voyage, the ship suffered a major mechanical failure. One of the engine's heavy pistons broke. To perform the necessary repairs, the CM London Express made an unscheduled stop in Savannah, Georgia. The engine was powered down, and Kurt, leading a crew of 7, descended into the belly of the ship. The work was intense and physically punishing. In the cramped, sweltering heat of the engine room, tempers began to flare. Kurt, under pressure to get the job done, clashed with the foreman. He felt the foreman was being lazy, and he didn't hold back from saying so. By the time the new piston was finally installed, a deep, bitter resentment had formed between Kurt and the rest of the team. Once the job was complete, Kurt dismissed the men, but kept the foreman behind to help him double-check the installation. To inspect the pistons properly, they had to access the scavenger air receiver, a massive 5-foot-long tube located right next to the engine block. The tube had access hatches on both ends, secured by heavy-duty latches known as dogs. Kurt opened his hatch, crawled inside the dark, confined space with his flashlight, and began his inspection. The foreman went to the opposite end, where he used a remote control to move the pistons into position so Kurt could see them through the scavenger ports. According to standard protocol, an inspector was supposed to examine every cylinder, a process that usually took about an hour. But Kurt was exhausted, hungry, and frustrated by the day's tensions. After rushing through his checks in a fraction of the expected time, he declared the job done. Both men exited the unit, secured their respective hatches, and went off to change, ready to leave port before a large incoming tanker took their spot. But as the ship prepared for departure at 8 p.m., a sudden realization rippled through the crew: Kurt was missing. The ship's atmosphere turned from busy to frantic. The captain sounded the alarm, and the entire crew began a desperate search. When a sailor passed the scavenger air receiver, he noticed something strange. A small, dirty rag was poking out of the top right corner of the forward hatch, and the lower 2 latches were not properly engaged. The sailor knew they had been having trouble getting a good seal on that hatch due to a divot in an O-ring, so he assumed someone had placed the rag there to help seal the gap and simply forgotten to lock the latches. The thought crossed his mind that Kurt might be inside, but there was a strict bureaucratic rule on board. Only the chief engineer, the foreman, or Kurt himself was allowed to open those hatches. Afraid of overstepping his bounds, the sailor played it safe. He simply closed the lower latches, securing the hatch, and reported the odd rag to his superior. Tragically, the communication broke down. When the chief engineer heard about the rag, he began making his way to the engine room. Simultaneously, the foreman had independently returned to the unit, opened the rear hatch, shined a light inside, and seeing nothing shut, and locked it. By the time the chief engineer arrived, the foreman assured him the unit was empty. The rag situation was ignored. Kurt was indeed inside. The terrifying reality, reconstructed by investigators later, was that Kurt had begun to doubt his own rushed inspection. Fearful that he would be blamed if the pistons failed again, and knowing the foreman disliked him, he decided to return to the tube alone to perform a thorough check. He wanted to do it quietly, without anyone knowing he was second-guessing his own work. He had entered the tube, but as he moved, he had accidentally slammed the hatch door shut. The heavy impact caused the upper latch to swivel and lock him in. He was trapped in a dark, 5-foot metal tomb. He had tried to scream, but the noise of the ship was deafening. No one could hear him. Seeing the tiny sliver of light at the top of the door, he had pushed his rag through the gap, desperate to signal his location. When he heard people outside, he prayed they would see it. Instead, he heard the chilling sounds of them locking the latches, sealing his fate. When the foreman opened the opposite hatch to check the unit, Kurt had been at the other end of the 5-foot tunnel, screaming in the dark, but the foreman hadn't seen him and had closed the hatch again. Kurt was left alone as the ship prepared to leave. He would have felt the air pressure shift as the engine began to churn. Then the temperature inside the tube started to rise. The engine heat, trapped within the steel walls of the scavenger air receiver, turned the unit into an oven. Kurt Smith was cooked alive, left behind by a series of fatal misunderstandings and a rigid, unyielding chain of command. 2 days later, when the ship reached Norfolk, the foreman opened the hatch and finally found him. It was a harrowing, avoidable end to a life cut short by professional pride and the absolute silence of a steel machine. In the end, what ties these three stories together is not just how they died, but how close they were to being saved and how no one could reach them in time. Harley was only a few meters away from his own home, trapped inside a narrow space that no one thought to check. A place that should have been empty became his final prison. He didn't disappear into the wilderness or vanish into the unknown. He was right there, hidden in plain sight, slowly running out of air while the world continued on just outside the walls. The most terrifying part is imagining those final moments when panic turned into realization and realization into silence. No matter how loud he tried to scream, no one heard him. And by the time they finally found him, the house had already kept his secret for far too long. Sean's fate was even crueler in a different way. He wasn't alone. He was surrounded by people, witnesses, police, trained professionals, yet none of them could save him. He was visible, within reach, calling out for help, and still completely unreachable. There is something deeply unsettling about that kind of helplessness. To know that people are right above you, looking down, trying everything they can, and still failing. His voice, once filled with panic and desperation, slowly faded into nothing. Not because help didn't come, but because it came too late. The city that never sleeps became the place where his final screams echoed into the night, unanswered. And then there was Kurt, who didn't fall into a trap or get pushed into danger. He walked into it himself, step by step, believing he was doing the right thing. His story is perhaps the most silent of them all. No witnesses. No crowd. No desperate eyes watching from above. Just darkness, metal walls, and the growing heat. He tried to leave a sign, a small piece of cloth, a final attempt to say, "I'm here," but even that was misunderstood. Instead of saving him, it sealed his fate. The sounds he made were swallowed by the roar of the ship, and the people who could have saved him unknowingly walked away. In the end, he wasn't just trapped physically, he was erased by a system that never realized he was still inside. What makes these stories linger is not just the horror of their deaths, but the pattern they reveal. In every case, there was a moment, a single, fragile moment where things could have gone differently. A glance in the right direction. A decision to double-check. A rule broken for just a second. But those moments passed, unnoticed, and once they were gone, there was no way back. It forces you to think about all the spaces we ignore every day. The walls, the ground beneath our feet, the machines we trust, without question. We believe we understand them, that they are safe because they are familiar. But these stories suggest something far more disturbing, that danger doesn't always come from the unknown. Sometimes it's hidden in the most ordinary places, waiting quietly for the exact moment when everything goes wrong. And maybe that's the most frightening truth of all. Because none of them thought they were in danger,
until it was already too late.
On the evening of Friday, the 12th of January, 2007, a college freshman by the name of Wade Steffi, who was 19 years old at the time, ventured inside the Ford Dining Hall, which is located on the campus of Purdue University. Not only is Purdue University in Indiana a respected and well-known institution of higher learning, but it is also well known for the exceptional academic programs that it offers, in addition to the substantial athletic opportunities that it provides. When it came to a situation like that, Wade was the perfect option to meet the requirements. A full academic scholarship to attend Purdue University was awarded to him because he was such a clever young man. He was so brilliant that he was able to attend Purdue University. At the time, he was working toward earning a degree in aviation technology, a field that held the potential to provide him with a future that was not only fascinating but also dense with prospects. He had his entire life ahead of him, a life that he had worked incredibly hard to get up to this point. He had a lot of work to do. Approximately 7:20 minutes before 7 o'clock in the evening, he entered the dining hall. In the spring semester, which had only begun a few days earlier, this was the very first Friday night of the semester. Put yourself in that space and try to imagine the buzzing energy that was there. The sound of buzzing could be heard. Students were distributed around the tables, and they were all engaged in conversation, laughter, and the process of making plans for the forthcoming weekend. There were a huge number of students. There was a distinct sense of excitement in the air, the kind of energy that can only be found at the beginning of something new for the first time. After Wade had finished acquiring a tray of food, he went to find a table where he could eat with a couple of his closest friends. He took a seat and immediately began participating in the discourse that was taking place. They talked about the new classes that they were going to be attending, the parties that were going to take place that evening, and the activities that they were going to take part in now that they were going to be coming back to school. There was nothing out of the usual about it, and that was the typical way of life in college. Over the course of nearly 1 hour, Wade sat there, exhibiting all of the qualities that are typical of a college student. He had a sense of freedom and possibilities throughout the time that he was surrounded by his friends. It was almost 8:20 o'clock in the evening when Wade looked at the time and realized that he needed to get going in order to meet his obligations. He stood up, said his goodbyes to the group, and then started to clear his tray in the same way that he had done 100 times before. He had done this 100 times before. After entering the chamber through the same doors that he had used to enter, he exited the room and stepped out into the brisk air of January. As soon as he was outside, he made a sharp right-left and continued to walk the very short distance to the building that was located just next to the dining hall. Owen Hall was the name of the structure that housed the dormitory that was located here. Nevertheless, Wade did not live at Owen Hall as his residence hall. It turned out to be a separate building, which was known as Cary Quad West, and it was situated on the opposite side of the dining hall from the place where he resided. In spite of this, Wade was heading to Owen since he had some additional friends who lived there, and he was going there. First, he went into Owen Hall, then he went to the room where his companions were staying, and last he went into the room. Already present at the beginning of the weekend were a few people who were simply lounging around, engaged in discussion, and drinking a few alcoholic beverages. This was the beginning of the weekend. Wade sat down and had a few of drinks for himself in addition to joining them in their activity. It took him about an hour to simply hang out and catch up with everyone. He did this without doing anything else. The gathering that took place before the party was relaxed and unstructured in its mood. At that point, which was somewhere about 9:30 o'clock in the evening, the entire party arrived at the consensus that it was time to leave and head to the main event. In the direction of a major party that was being held at one of the organizations on campus, they left Owen Hall together and started walking approximately half a mile to the west, away from the core section of the school. They were heading in the direction of the party. For a considerable amount of time, Wade remained present at the fraternity celebration. During the time that he was simply having a wonderful time with his friends, the music was playing at a very loud volume, and the facility was entirely full. An idea, on the other hand, came to him at around midnight. He was immediately impressed by it. He went to one of his friends and told him that he had just recalled something that he had been thinking about. He then thanked him for his attention. It was discovered that he had left his jacket at the room of his friend in Owen Hall, which he had forgotten earlier. Despite the fact that it was a chilly evening, he had the want to go back to the spot and collect it. This was a clear and commonplace justification for leaving a party. It was the kind of thing that happens on a regular basis when people leave parties. However, this seemingly little action would set in motion a chain of bad and odd circumstances that would inevitably follow. The fact that all of the dormitories on the Purdue campus lock up at night for reasons of safety was one of the obstacles that needed to be overcome. The only way to access the building after a given hour is if you are a resident of that particular building and hold a keycard, or if you know someone who lives within the building and can physically unlock the door for you. If you do not meet either of these requirements, you will not be able to enter the facility. Wade could not simply swipe his way inside the building because he did not live in Owen Hall. This prevented him from entering the building. It was necessary for him to rely on one of his friends who lived there in order to acquire entry to the location. Therefore, as soon as he started walking back towards Owen Hall, he pulled out his mobile phone and began conversing on it till he reached his destination. Wade would make a total of 6 phone calls over the course of his journey, urgently trying to locate someone, anybody, in Owen Hall who would answer the door and open it for him. He would do this in an effort to find someone who would help him. However, despite his best efforts, he was not successful in accomplishing what he set out to do. It was a total of 4 calls that he made, 4 of which were to fictitious phone numbers. You are able to anticipate the confusion that he will feel. A person would answer the phone when he dialed the number, and he would ask them to let him into Owen Hall. He would do this again and again. On the other hand, the individual who answered the phone would not have any previous knowledge of the subject matter that he was discussing. They would hang up the phone after stating, "I'm sorry, you've got the wrong number," before saying the phrase. Additionally, he called 2 people who he was positive truly lived within Owen Hall. He was certain that they were resident there. Nevertheless, they did not answer their phones when they were phoned, and it is unclear what would have caused this. Maybe they had already gone to sleep, maybe they had their phones muted, or maybe they were still present at the party or other event. All of these possibilities are possible. Their phones continued to ring and ring until they reached the voicemail system, regardless of the circumstances that they were in. As a result of this, Wade went back to Owen Hall at about 12:30 inches the morning, having exhausted all of the options that were accessible to him. Then he approached the primary glass doors, which were now securely shut, and started hammering on them. However, they were still open. He took his phone out of his pocket and then reinserted it into his pocket a moment later. He was expecting that a local resident who was already inside would notice him and let him in. He had high hopes that this would happen. Additionally, in the end, it was finished by somebody. After hearing the banging, a student who lived in Owen Hall went to the door to see what was going on. They were curious about what was going on. This student was not someone Wade had ever encountered before, and Wade himself was not familiar with them. When the student peered through the glass, they saw Wade standing there. Wade was there. To phrase it another way, the student made a choice at that very instant in time. They were of the opinion that Wade was incapable of entering the building since he appeared to be under the influence of alcohol. It's possible that they were trying to follow the guidelines, but it's also possible that they simply did not want to be responsible for him. Both of these possibilities are possible. The decision that they made was to not allow him to enter. A tiny shake of the head was given by each of them as they stepped away from the entrance. Even though Wade remained to stand there for a short while longer, likely knocking a few more times in astonishment, he eventually just gave up and walked away. He had no chance of convincing himself otherwise. He then proceeded away from the doors and disappeared into the darkness after he had turned around and turned around again. Following the passage of a few days, we are now on the 16th of January, which is a Tuesday. After spending the lengthy weekend away from campus, Wade's roommate has finally made their way back to their dorm room in Cary Quad West. This comes after they had been absent for a considerable amount of time. His first observation was that there was no one else there in the room. He was the only person there. The absence of Wade was unmistakable. If he had not slept in his bed for at least a few days, it seemed as though he had not been there for quite some time. The roommate did not give it any attention when it first occurred to her that she might be committing the act. There is a possibility that Wade was either at the library or in class at the time. Nevertheless, as the hours passed and there was still no trace of him, a microscopic seed of anxiety began to become more and more obvious. This concern was growing in intensity. He attempted to contact Wade by calling him and sending him texts, but he did not encounter any reaction from him. There was no response to any of the texts that were sent, and all of the calls were forwarded to the voicemail system. The roommate's level of concern escalated, and she started asking other people on their floor whether or not they had seen Wade. She was concerned that Wade might have been hiding elsewhere. The reaction was consistent throughout the entire process. He had not been seen by anyone since Friday night, when he was last spotted. At this time, the anxiety had evolved into a legitimate alarm that needed to be addressed. After much deliberation, the roommate took the decision to communicate with Wade's family in the expectation that they would be aware of his whereabouts. There was a possibility that he had made the choice to spend the weekend at home without alerting anyone before making the decision. The moment he did eventually get the chance to talk to them, however, his heart sank. There was not a single member of Wade's family who was aware of his whereabouts. They were looking forward to hearing from him rather than hearing about him from other people. At the end of the day, the issue was glaringly obvious to everyone who was paying attention. After investigation, it was found that Wade Steffi had disappeared. This information was communicated to the authorities, and they immediately began working to address the matter. One of the first things that they did was contact Wade's mobile phone operator to inquire about the possibilities of tracking his phone. This was one of the first things that they began doing. It was possible for the provider to receive a signal from it while it was in operation. The fact that the phone was being utilized was a development that held a favorable significance. Unfortunately, the location was extremely vague, which was a turn of events that was not to be expected. But the one thing that they were able to prove was that Wade's mobile phone continued to be located somewhere on the enormous Purdue campus. This was the only thing that they were able to verify. Any place could have been the venue of the event. The evening of that day, a comprehensive search that included the entire campus was undertaken. I applaud the effort that you put forth in this matter. A significant number of law enforcement officials and volunteers carried out a comprehensive search that covered the entirety of the grounds of the university. The school's equestrian club, which consisted of pupils exploring the nearby fields and woodlands while mounted on horses, was also responsible for giving their involvement. They looked in every potential site where a person could be, they searched inside buildings, they searched in green locations, and they looked in every imaginable position. To the contrary, despite the enormous search effort that would continue for a number of weeks, very little was found. This was the case despite the fact that the search would continue. In order to establish Wade's existence, they would only find a single pair of his shoes when they searched for him. After only a little over 4 days after the beginning of the search, the shoe is found once more on the 20th of January. It was built in a location that was right outside of an exterior entry that went into a maintenance room for Owen Hall, which was situated inside the structure. This was a vital opportunity for the case to be broken, and it was taken advantage of. Owen Hall was the very last location that Wade attempted to access, and it was the site that he was unsuccessful. It appeared as though the discovery of his shoe just there was evidence that he had been in that particular location. Once they arrived, the detectives immediately concentrated their attention on the maintenance room as the first area they found themselves. Once they had opened the door, they began to conduct a thorough check of the area immediately surrounding it. Wade, on the other hand, was not even present. In spite of the fact that the area was nothing more than a utility compartment, there was no evidence to suggest that he had ever been inside. Despite the fact that the shoe was a clue, an impasse was reached as a result of the hint that led to the shoe. There seems to be no end to the weeks. Although the investigation continued, there was a growing sense of pessimism about the outcome. Following over a month of searching, the official search was finally called off. During that period, there were no fresh leads discovered, and Wade was nowhere to be seen. Finally, the search was called off. The fact that Wade's family and friends were in the dark about his death caused them to suffer in great sorrow. Recently, his disappearance had taken place on a college campus that was teeming with activity. After Wade had been reported missing for nearly 2 months, the inquiry took an unusual and unexpected turn on March 19, which was approximately 2 months later. The event took place on the 19th of March. One of the employees working in the maintenance department was carrying out his daily duties in the laundry room that was situated in the basement of Owen Hall. While he was working, he became aware of an odd sound that was coming over. An unmistakable popping sound could be heard. Initially, the worker did not have a great deal of anxiety regarding the matter. Through his deductions, he came to the conclusion that the source of the noise was most likely one of the dryers or the washing machines. Inside of a machine, there was a coin that was scattered around or a button made of metal that was being mixed up. Both of these things were loose. Within the confines of a laundry room, it was a disturbance that was heard rather frequently. He continued with his task, but 1 moment later, he was confronted with yet another hearing of it. What a pop! The following time, he made the choice to investigate the matter further. He started moving around the laundry room, pausing at regular intervals to pay close attention to each of the machines that were functioning in an effort to locate the source of the noise. He was trying to determine where the noise was coming from. During this time, he once again heard the popping sound. However, this time it was abundantly clear that the sound was not coming from any of the washers or dryers or any other device. He was able to positively identify the source of the sound. The fact of the situation is that it was not actually coming from within the laundry room at all. This is the genuine reality. It originated from a point that was not in close proximity to the entrance of the hall. The worker entered the corridor after developing a sense of curiosity, which led him to leave the washing room and proceed to enter the corridor. When he had finished standing there in the tranquil ambiance of the corridor that led down to the basement, he heard the pop once more. At this point, it was much simpler to comprehend. This time, the sound was coming from behind the locked door that was located directly across from the laundry room, and it was clear that it was coming from that particular location. After taking out his enormous ring of keys, the worker found the key that was suitable with the lock, and then he released it. This allowed him to unlock the door that was directly in front of him. He went inside in order to gain access. After a few moments had passed, he would have a realization that would be quite upsetting. We are now in a position to reconstruct these specific events that took place with Wade Steffi during the early morning hours of January 13th. This is made possible by the fact that this discovery was made, as well as the subsequent study that was carried out. Wade did not simply leave the building after being denied entrance into Owen Hall, nor did he simply walk away from the building after the student refused to unlock the door because they believed he was too intoxicated. Both of these events occurred after Wade was denied access into Owen Hall. In his determination to collect his jacket, he had not wavered in the least. As a consequence of this, he left the building by the front doors and then found his way to the left side of the structure where he looked for an alternative access point. During the course of his exploration of the building, he came across an additional entrance. It should come as no surprise that the pupils were not supposed to get access through this particular entryway. Although there was no sign on it that proclaimed "Keep Out," it was extremely obvious when it was present. This was the case even though there was no official notice. There was no question in anyone's mind that the metal railing that was installed along the exterior of this door was there for the sole purpose of preventing people from even coming close to making contact with it. By itself, the door was not built at ground level. It was erected by someone else. Construction was carried out in the basement, where it was positioned into a concrete pit for the purpose of construction. In order for you to go up to it, you would have to first jump down into this pit and then climb over the safety barrier. This would be essential. Because this door was constantly locked, it was essential to acquire a key in order to get entry to it by any means required. This door could only be accessed by going through the building, which was the correct way there. In contrast, it was predetermined that this would be the outcome. Despite the fact that Wade was under the influence of alcohol at the time, he did not perceive any danger when he came upon this entrance on the side of Owen Hall that was definitely off limits. He was aware of a problem that could arise. In light of the fact that he believed it would be an excellent notion, he made the decision to attempt to get in this method. As far as he was concerned, the events that were taking place behind the door were of no consequence to him. If he were to get inside a piece of Owen Hall, he reasoned, he would be able to find his way up to his friend's room and reclaim his jacket. He would be able to do this if he could just sneak inside. As a consequence of this, he raced straight toward the railing. Following his ascent over it, he made a hasty descent into the small concrete hole that was situated below. As soon as he landed in front of the door, he stretched out and grabbed the doorknob, and then he began working on it. His surprise was compounded by the fact that it was fully open. There was no lock located on it. Upon entering the room, he was the one who opened the door and entered. Immediately after that, he was completely and utterly enveloped in darkness, beginning at that very moment. The buzzing and churning of machines all around him was the only sound he could hear in the darkness. That was the only sound he could hear. The rest of the world was also silent. Even though he was under the influence of alcohol, he was able to return to the realization that this was still a good strategy. The fact that he was unable to find a light switch was the only reason why he was actually concerned about the situation. It was so dark inside that he was worried that if the door closed behind him, not only would his one and only source of light be cut off, but the door would actually lock, so confining him inside this peculiar space that was gloomy. He was anxious about this because the temperature inside was so low. With that in mind, he came up with an easy solution to the issue. Kneeling down, removing one of his shoes, and tucking it into the door jamb were the steps he took in order to successfully prop the door open. A sliver of light from the outside was able to penetrate the chamber as a result of the door being propped open behind him. He then began to advance further into the area as a result of this. After that, he was involved in a collision with a massive metal structure. This took place almost quickly after that. Due to the fact that it was still too dark, he was unable to see what it was, yet he was strongly aware of its presence. It was a metal structure that was flat and appeared to be a massive cabinet or a machine of some kind. The object was something that was flat. Upon hearing the buzzing and whirring sound, he was able to discover that it was one of the machines that was responsible for making the sound. Recently, he came to the conclusion that he would make an effort to walk around everything. His objective was straightforward. He needed to go through this room, find another door on the opposite side, and then continue his journey up into the dormitory. He intended to do all of these things. Wade moved his hand all the way along the edge of the machine as he began to go toward the left side of the machine. He was under the assumption that the machine had to stop working at some point in order for him to be able to go around it. This machine, on the other hand, turned out to be exceedingly enormous and incredibly wide from the beginning. When he eventually reached the left edge of it, he was so close to the wall of the room that he was almost touching it. He was in such close proximity to the wall. Upon his arrival, he became aware of the fact that the space that existed between the side of the machine and the wall of the chamber was only slightly larger than what would allow a human to pass through. This realization came to him almost immediately. If he turned his body to the side, there is a chance that he possesses the ability to make it. Despite the fact that he was not sure of the precise distance that this odd gadget traveled back into the room, he was of the opinion that it was a good idea. In order to accomplish this, he arranged himself in such a way that his chest was facing the machine and his back was against the wall of the room. The next thing he did was begin the process of forcing himself into the limited space within the room. He was holding his hands up in a manner that was comparable to protecting his face and neck from whatever was in front of him while he was slowly making his way through. He was doing this while he was slowly making his way through. A further point to consider is that at some point in time, while he was strolling by himself, he began to trip. This tight space between the machine and the wall saved him from actually falling. Yet, for a split second, he reflexively stretched out with his hands to support himself on the machine that was directly in front of him. He was essentially trapped into this narrow area between the machine and the wall. Moreover, his left ring finger was able to fit into a very small hole on the face of the machine, which was around 2 inches deep. This was a very fortunate occurrence. This terrible accident was brought about by nothing more than random occurrence. In the room that Wade was presently using for himself, the name of the room was an electrical vault. Additionally, it was outfitted with 6 large transformers that were of a high power. The machine that his finger had just become stuck inside of was one of the machines that he pointed to. What you saw was the machine. These 6 transformers were tasked with the obligation of transforming the extremely high voltage that they acquired from the major power grid into a lesser voltage that could be employed. This was the responsibility that they were tasked with. After that, this voltage was dispersed throughout Owen Hall in order to supply electricity to the lights, outlets, and everything else that was located throughout the building. Even though the majority of the exterior of these transformers had been covered with protective materials in order to lessen the likelihood of electrocution, there were still a few locations of these devices in which there was just nothing that could be done to prevent electrocution from occurring. It was quite likely that they would get electrocuted, which was a possible risk that they posed. When working with it, you needed to exercise extra caution since the hole that Wade's finger had just fallen into was 2 inches deep. This was one of those parts that required you to be extra careful. At the back of that particular hole, there was an exposed electrical conductor that was located. As soon as the tip of his finger made contact with that conductor, a rush of electricity ranging from 2,000 to 4,000 volts was shot into his body. For the purpose of providing a point of comparison, the electric chair is frequently utilized for the purpose of executing individuals, and the voltage that is typically utilized to electrocute them is 2,000 volts. It is widely believed that Wade passed away instantly. However, his body did not just fall to the ground as he died away because he was crushed up against the wall and the transformer in such a way that it was so closely packed together. This caused his body to be pressed up against both of these objects. But he proceeded to keep himself in a position that was just partially upright, with his finger still stuck inside that hole. He did this for a considerable amount of time. From that moment forward, his body continued to be electrocuted at every single second of every single day for the coming 2 months. This occurred until the month of February. At some point during the month of March, Wade's body fluids started to drain out of him, which caused the electrical current that was being pumped into him to shift its path despite the fact that it had been flowing in the other direction since the beginning of the month. A sound that sounded like it was cracking or arcing could be heard emanating from beyond his body and into the base of the earth. When the maintenance worker heard the popping sound coming from the laundry room, he knew it was originating from there. Specifically, it was the sound of the electrical current making contact with the ground. One of the only other entrances that led into the electrical vault was the door that the maintenance guy opened in order to investigate the sound. This was the only other entry that led into the vault. Nevertheless, the door that Wade had used to enter the facility was the door that led to the exterior of the structure. Upon opening the door to the interior and taking a quick look inside, the worker did not first observe Wade. He did not even notice him at first. On the other side, he had the unpleasant experience of smelling something that was rather strange. Because of this, he proceeded to advance further into the area and navigate his way around the various pieces of equipment that were there. It was at that very moment when he became aware of Wade's lifeless carcass. The shoe that Wade was wearing had at some point in time escaped from the door jamb when it was discovered by the police earlier on January 26. Wade was wearing the shoe at the time. At the time that it was found, it was no longer doing its job of keeping the door to the outside open. Within that pit area, it was just sitting there, and the door that led to the outside compartment was shut and secured. When the shoe was found, the law enforcement officers did in fact go into the electrical vault to retrieve the shoe. They did not, on the other hand, enter through the entrance that was located off the street. They navigated their way around and approached the internal entry that was identical to the one that the maintenance worker will use in the future. The laundry house was located just across the hall from this door, which was the one that was in question. And when they opened it, all they did was look into the room from the entrance, but they did not actually go inside. They did not walk all the way into the room when they entered it with their feet. During the process of shining their flashlights around the area, they became aware of the transformers and identified them. Wade's name was called out during this time. This was due to the fact that they were standing in the doorway, which prevented them from seeing him from their vantage point. It was impossible to see his body because of the large transformer that he was packed behind. This made it tough to recognize him. Consequently, this was the reason why they had previously indicated that Wade had not been present in that room throughout the entire time. The error was a bad one that was brought about by an angle that was just impossible to achieve. In the end, the investigation came to the realization that the door that connects to the exterior of the electrical vault was intended to be entirely secured at all times. This was the overall conclusion that was reached. It is quite clear that this was not the situation as a result of Wade's participation in the discussion. As a consequence of this, it was finally determined that Purdue University had engaged in negligent behavior. The parties came to an agreement that they would pay Wade's family a total of $500,000. This was the settlement that was reached. They also established a scholarship in Wade's name, which assured that his memory would be carried on by aiding other outstanding students in following their dreams at the university where Wade's life was cut so tragically short for no apparent reason. The story was one of a string of catastrophes that got progressively worse. There was a series of seemingly insignificant choices that were made on a typical Friday night, such as forgetting the jacket, not answering the phone calls, and deciding to find another way to enter, but finally led to a tragic and avoidable end. These choices included everything from forgetting the jacket to not answering the phone calls. I want to express my gratitude for your presence here today. If you watched the program that was broadcast today, I would appreciate it if you could share your ideas with me in the comments area. Also, bear in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of True Crime waiting for you to watch in one sitting right now. You may watch all of these episodes in one sitting till the next time we meet again. What's going on? On Sunday afternoon, the 12th of March 2006, 39-year-old Michael Zamiti Jr., known as Mike, was riding his ATV. In Freedom, New Hampshire, he glided across a huge frozen lake. Mike smiled as the cold air nipped at his cheeks and felt sharp in his lungs with every breath. Totally enjoyed it here. Mike resided in Wakefield, Massachusetts, 2 hours away for most of the year. Freedom was his escape. His parents owned a summer home on this lake, and he had come here his whole life. He felt at home in this tiny, tranquil lakeside hamlet where his real-life stress could melt away. Mike recently took a big stride. His parents lived just down the street from his Freedom vacation home, which he acquired. This purchase was huge for him. It signified his triumph. Mike owned a Wakefield cement contracting business. He spent years creating all-state concrete pumping, countless long days, and restless nights. He wanted to provide his wife, Michelle, and 3 children a good life. This second mansion, this lakeside refuge, proved he had succeeded. He succeeded. Success was costly. His marriage was also deeply strained by his concrete industry work. As boss, he had all the responsibility and brutal hours. He traveled often. This left Michelle and the kids mostly alone. She handled most of the children, housework, and juggling while he worked. She had lately informed Mike that his frequent absence, no matter how much money it brought in, was hurting her and their family. These ideas ran through Mike's head as his ATV skimmed the ice. Success, stress, marriage. He was attempting to comprehend it. He saw it then. He saw another ATV approaching from across the lake. His gut nodded as it approached. He recognized the driver. Sean Fitzpatrick was his other marital issue. Sean was their lakeside neighbor. He was the Zamiti family's close buddy for years. He resided in Freedom year-round after retiring. Sean was always around when Mike and his family visited. He came over for dinner and barbecue. On his boat, he took the kids. Mike's kids called him Uncle Sean because he was so present. Last summer, Mike found something that ended their friendship. He discovered his wife Michelle was cheating with Sean. Mike was devastated by the finding. Everything felt like it had shifted in his universe. Despite the treachery, Steve and Michelle decided to stay married. Still in love, they had 3 kids to consider. They started therapy together to repair things. Mike and Sean had no relationship. Mike hadn't spoken to Sean since learning. Mike disliked conflict. He found it easy to avoid Sean and rebuild his life with Michelle. Mike didn't want Sean coming right for him. He instinctively throttled his ATV, turned it around, and sped off. It was too late. Sean waved him down as he slowed. Mike felt shackled. He reluctantly stopped his ATV and waited for Sean. Sean skipped small conversation. He looked at Mike and stated he was delighted he met him. He wanted to apologize to Mike for last summer with Michelle. He acknowledged it wasn't okay and hoped they could go on. Sean's sincerity surprised Mike. Mike said, "You know what? It's all good," without meaning it because he despised awkward situations. Not everything was good. However, expressing that ended this awkward conversation the fastest. Mike really wanted to leave Sean and return home. He instructed Sean to hurry because Michelle needed him to pack the car. Before Sean could respond, Mike turned his ATV around and drove it back across the ice, leaving him alone on the frozen lake. Mike entered his holiday home 15 minutes later. He observed a row of nicely packed and zipped luggage beside the door first. He smiled within. Michelle had finished everything. Soon after, she entered and kissed him. He was assured the youngsters were finishing up cleaning their rooms and would leave soon. Suddenly, a car horn beeped twice outside. Michelle rolled her eyes and laughed. They both knew who it was. Must be Mike's parents. His parents spent the weekend in freedom at their house down the street. The 2-hour trip back to Wakefield was also planned. Michelle laughed because the family joke was that Mike and his father couldn't go a day without chatting. Michael Sr., Mike's father, shared more than his name. Both father and son were best friends and business partners. Mike Jr. ran Allstate Concrete, owned by Michael Sr., a true family company. Mike had never considered alternatives. He jumped right into the concrete industry after high school and worked with his dad ever since. Like any business, the company struggled over time. Previously, a former employee filed a difficult case. Overall, Allstate Concrete was a success. Today, business was flourishing. Their time and resources were being consumed by a large Boston construction project. Outside, Mike visited his folks and talked shop with his dad. He asked Michael Sr. if he had called Chester Roberts, their employee. Mike asked Chester to join him in the office the next morning with his dad. Chester was their part-time driver and handyman. He was their most reliable worker in his early 50s. Chester was the first person they called during busy weeks. Mike was relieved when his dad claimed he'd spoken to Chester. They were ready for tomorrow. They parted ways after a few more minutes of talking. Mike Jr. assured his dad he'd see him in the morning, then walked inside to pack his family. The next morning, Monday, March 13, Mike Jr. drove his vehicle into Wakefield's Allstate Concrete parking lot before 8. He arrived on time. Being the first, he saw a light rain falling. He jumped out, ran across the wet pavement, and unlocked a side door next to a huge garage bay door. The Allstate building had a huge garage. Their cement trucks could pull through its 3 massive roll-up doors. Mike and his father handled all the paperwork and administrative responsibilities in a small office on the second floor. Mike took the metal stairway to the office after entering the vast, quiet garage. He relaxed into his desk chair and considered the week's itinerary, logistics, and mental to-do list. He heard another car enter the parking lot minutes after. Mike assumed it was his father. Chester was another employee who walked to work. He lived close. Mike then heard the basement door open and footsteps go up the stairs. Another truck entered the Allstate Concrete parking lot minutes later. Senior Michael. After parking his truck next to his son's, he ran for the side door to escape the rain. He pushed the door, but it didn't open. It stuck. It opened a few inches. Confused, he looked through the crack to see what was preventing it. His blood chilled. He froze. A man lay face down on the concrete floor in a dark, spreading pool of blood. The garage was dark, so Michael Sr. couldn't see the man's face. He had no idea who it was, but he knew it was not his son with painful certainty. Mike Jr. was a huge, broad-shouldered man, yet even in weak light showed a lesser physique. Michael Sr. felt his heart pounding his ribs. He could only retreat from the door, get his phone, and contact 911. Panic ensued after he hung up with the dispatcher, who promised help. He couldn't wait in the rain. A man was dead or dying in his business. His son was supposed to be there. It was his son's truck in the parking lot. He must enter. Mike had to be found and checked on. Michael Sr. staggered past the blocked side entrance and went to a wide roll-up garage door. He opened it, creating a dark, spacious entrance to the structure. He saw no one in the big garage. Running inside, he screamed his son's name repeatedly. No one answered. Mike! Mike! Just the sound of his furious speech in the vast, empty space. His son was absent from the ground floor. Michael Sr. sprinted for the stairs and took them two at a time to the second-floor office, his heart racing. He froze when he entered the office. The world stopped turning. Mike Jr., his son, was bloodied and collapsed in the office desk chair. After an hour, Massachusetts State Trooper Kevin Baker pulled up to Allstate Concrete in his cruiser. He saw police swarming the enormous industrial facility. Yellow caution tape surrounded the property. At least a dozen Wakefield Police Department crime scene techs and officers collected evidence by entering and exiting an open garage door. Trooper Baker was with the state police, not Wakefield. Massachusetts state troopers led homicide investigations with local police as usual. Baker believed this case needed all the aid it could get. Violence like this wasn't common in Wakefield. It was a lovely, safe hamlet 10 miles north of Boston. In this little village, everyone knew each other. Double homicides were rare here. Baker got out of his car and searched for the leader. His wait was short. Detective Richard Cass of Wakefield Police rushed over and introduced himself. Cass told Baker to follow him to the open garage bay and gave him a quick update. 2 dead men were inside. Both were shot. The company's owner, Michael Zamiti Sr., found them around 8 this morning. Baker followed Cass into the huge garage. They approached the first victim, face down on the concrete floor inside the smaller side door. Cass identified the victim as 5'1" Chester Roberts. Allstate hired him as a part-time truck driver and handyman. It was easy to spot him. Chester was a famous local who did odd jobs around town. He was known to Detective Cass. Baker saw Chester was shot in the back as he kneeled by the body. It appeared to be a shotgun burst. Pellets showed the spray pattern. No other injuries, struggle, or defensive wounds on his hands or arms were apparent. Baker rose and surveyed the garage. He saw no robbery signs. Unused, pricey equipment was outside. Nothing fell or was displaced. Chester's killer seems to have sneaked up behind him and shot him without his knowledge. Baker checked the doors and windows for a while. There were no traces of forced entry again. It didn't matter much. Chester probably opened the building for the day, and the killer followed. After surveying the first floor, Baker told Cass he was ready to visit the second victim upstairs. Baker followed Cass into the second-floor office where 39-year-old Mike Zamiti Jr.'s body was found. Detective Cass whispered that he knew Mike, like Chester. This office scene was awful. Mike wasn't shot once in the torso, like Chester. Shot in the chest and face. Shotgun bursts were catastrophic. Blood covered his desk, chair, and paperwork. Mike was practically unrecognizable. Baker was struck by more than the gruesomeness. Body posture. Mike remained slouched at his desk. It looked like execution. The killer seems to have entered the office with one goal: to kill Mike Simiti. They touched nothing else. They entered and shot him in the face before he could stand up. This was deeply personal and deliberate. Baker developed a theory as he thought about this. Mike Jr. was presumably the first casualty. He was shot before Chester got at the building. Mike would have heard a shotgun explosion downstairs otherwise. He wouldn't have sat comfortably at his desk, surprised. Mike being shot first would strengthen the perception that he was the main target. Other than the awful brutality, the crime scene was tidy. The killer left no bloody tracks, smudges, or traces of searching beyond the victims. Baker quickly considered one idea: Italian-American construction family Zimitis. Fit a stereotype. He told Cass he wondered if this was a professional mob hit. While listening, Cass seemed attentive. He said Baker he knew the Zimitis well and that Mike Jr. and his father were decent people. He didn't think they'd be involved in mafia deals. But he admitted it was plausible, especially because Allstate Concrete was one of the Big Dig contractors. Baker's ears perked up immediately. The Big Dig was America's largest and most expensive construction endeavor. A Boston Harbor tunnel was a major project. However, the project was a civic nightmare. There were accusations of mafia involvement and corrupt payoffs from the outset, and it was years behind schedule and over budget. Baker now had to consider the possibility that the Zimitis had either become engaged in those shady transactions or crossed the wrong person at work. Baker believed the killer was a business associate, even if this had nothing to do with the mob. Someone who knew the company, building layout, and that Mike would be alone early in the morning was needed. Chester, the second casualty, was probably not intended. Baker wasn't clear why Chester was slain. Due to his late arrival and witness status, he could have been eliminated. He may have been involved in the Zimitis' fight. Baker stood still, scrutinizing the bloody paperwork on the desk. He then told Cass that they needed a thorough list of Allstate's previous and present workers and clientele. While strolling around the workplace, he saw a 1.6 gauge shotgun shell on the floor. He ordered a crime scene tech to bag it and examine the building for more ammunition. Baker and Cassie returned outside. Behind the police tape, a few observers and reporters had gathered. Baker requested Cass to talk with Michael Zimiti Sr., the body finder, outside. DCAS shook his head. He said Michael Sr. was disoriented and barely able to communicate when he came due to grief and shock. Cass decided to send him home. When Michelle, Mike Jr.'s wife, arrived, another cop did the same. She hysterically claimed to have heard of an accident. When she learned her husband was dead, they took her home too. Baker accepted but wasn't pleased. Time matters in murder investigations. He preferred to speak to crucial witnesses and family members quickly while their recollections were fresh. He was sorry to miss the chance to talk to Michelle right away because the spouse is always a suspect in homicides. There was still a lot of work to do at the scene, but Wakefield police knew where to find the family. Baker advised Cass to canvass surrounding businesses for witnesses or security cameras. The next morning, March 14, Trooper Baker parked in front of the Zimiti family house in Wakefield. He and Detective Cass spoke with Michael Sr. After receiving Chester and Mike's initial autopsy reports, they didn't find anything new. Mike was shot twice, Chester once. Death struck both guys instantaneously. However, detectives had one hopeful lead. No CCTV cameras were detected on the Allstate Concrete facility, but surrounding businesses had them. A team of officers was meticulously scrutinizing the clip. Another Baker team interviewed Chester Roberts' family. He could have been wrong, and Chester, not Mike, was the target. Beyond that, crime scene techs uncovered little physical evidence. There were no usable prints. The morning of the murders, it rained, so they couldn't lift any clear footprints or wheel marks from outside the structure. Now Baker was betting on Michael Sr. He knocked on the main door, hoping the heartbroken father might direct them. Baker and Cass joined Michael Sr. and Pat, Mike's mother, in the Zamidi living room a minute later. Both parents seemed shocked. Michael Sr. was shivering as Pat sat silently crying. Baker saw them now and felt Cass had made the proper decision to send Michael Sr. home the day before. Even 24 hours later, they were too distraught to give precise answers. Baker opted to be brief. He first requested Michael Sr. to explain the body discovery again. The father gave the 911 dispatcher the same tale, all aligned. Baker proceeded to his actual purpose. He inquired whether anyone wanted to hurt Mike Jr. Michael Sr. shakily breathed. He noted that in the building industry, you sometimes encounter stiff competition. But he and his son always tried to get along with everyone. Fighting was terrible for business, he argued. But as he said this, he sat up taller, as if he had noticed something. He indicated a previous employee had a vengeance against them. It was his nephew, Hank Jennings. Hank sued the corporation a few years ago for unpaid overtime wages. They settled with Hank out of court, but the whole thing had sparked animosity. There was still much hatred. Mike Sr. glanced at his wife Pat, who nodded and said it had been difficult and turbulent. Baker meticulously recorded Hank's facts. After chatting with Mike's parents for a while, he and Cass left. Baker knew he would need to talk to the Zamidis again, but for now, he would give them room. He and Cass had a new lead. They'd investigate Hank Jennings. Baker returned to Cass's Wakefield Police Department office 2 days later to review crime scene images and witness accounts. He was getting restless. After meeting Mike's parents, he hoped Hank Jennings, the bitter cousin, would be their guy. They dispatched officers to find Hank for an interview, but they hadn't found him yet. They had reached Mike's wife Michelle and questioned her at home. She didn't give them much information. She said she was home with her kids when her husband was murdered. She claimed she didn't know anyone who had hurt him. Baker and Cass examined Allstate Concrete's financial records but found no mafia connections. Still, they were better off than a few days earlier. Detectives reviewing surveillance footage from businesses near Allstate discovered something. One security camera faced the street in front of the Allstate building. The angle wasn't right to show the company's parking lot. It recorded all street entry and leave vehicles from the parking lot. Cameras captured Mike Jr.'s truck arriving at work at 7:39 a.m. 5 minutes later, an unknown green pickup truck arrived at 7:44. A few minutes later, Chester Roberts arrived on foot. The same green truck left the parking lot at 7:50. 12 minutes passed before Michael Sr.'s red truck arrived at 8:02. Massive break. The killer probably drove that green truck and killed Mike and Chester between 7:44 and 7:50 a.m. The video quality didn't show the driver or license plate, but knowing the killer's likely vehicle's make and color was crucial. They could narrow their suspect list. Just then, the desk phone rang. Baker watched Cass grab it. After listening, Cass looked confused. He thanked the caller and promised to arrive. He hung up and faced Baker. He claimed Michelle Zamidi was calling. She called to share new information she hadn't shared in her first interview. She said it was crucial. Baker and Cass sat across from Michelle in her living room again 15 minutes later. Baker saw her as a different person. She appeared horrified and grieving 2 days earlier. She looked incredibly nervous now. She fidgeted with a stack of condolence cards on the coffee table, touching her hair. Baker mentioned the cards, and Michelle nodded. Many friends and neighbors from Wakefield and their second home in Freedom, New Hampshire, had reached out. Michelle breathed deeply and got to the point. They were denied information, she said. She described her Freedom neighbor, Sean Fitzpatrick. She acknowledged having an affair with him. Baker was dumbfounded. The case was transformed by a secret love triangle. Sean and Michelle had a strong reason to avoid Mike. Michelle revealed that her husband knew about the affair before Baker could ask a follow-up. She described the therapy and how they had worked hard to save their marriage. She said she broke up with Sean a month ago. She added that Sean was furious. Baker looked at Cass. They shared a thought. They must speak to Sean Fitzpatrick now. Michelle was once again the top suspect after this new information. Maybe she wanted her husband gone to be with her lover. She may have told them this now to control the story before they found out. More evidence is needed to prove any of that. Michelle gave Baker Sean's contact information and address, and Baker said they'd contact her. Later that night, Baker and Cass returned to her office. A second officer was ready to provide a vital update. Baker immediately sent officers to Freedom, New Hampshire to interview Sean Fitzpatrick after speaking with Michelle. One of those officers returned to Wakefield to report his findings. Baker wanted simple answers first. Has Sean Fitzpatrick owned a green truck? Officer shook his head. Sean had a bright red truck, he said. The officer stated that Sean denied having an affair with Michelle when questioned. He said he and Michelle were close, but just family friends. The officers interviewing him never revealed that they knew he was lying, and Michelle had confessed everything. Baker almost laughed at this. He initially doubted Sean's denial. His blatant lying made him look guilty. Before Baker could respond, the officer added another crucial detail: that Sean had a good alibi. One of his neighbors confirmed that he was at home in Freedom on the murder morning. This neighbor took a walk every morning at 9, and she remembered seeing Sean outside his house at that time. In frustration, Baker sighed. Freedom, New Hampshire to Wakefield, Massachusetts takes 2 hours. Sean could not have killed Mike and Chester by 7:50 a.m. in Wakefield and then at his Freedom home an hour and 10 minutes later. Physically impossible. Suddenly, Sean Fitzpatrick, their most promising lead, felt like another dead end. 5 days after the murders, Baker and Cass stood behind a Wakefield church on March 18. They attended Mike Zamitti's funeral. The church was packed, showing how much the community loved Mike. However, the two investigators weren't just paying respects. They finally spoke to Mike's cousin, Hank Jennings, who sued the company. Cass suggested they corner him at the funeral since they hadn't been able to reach him. Despite the animosity, he was family and would attend. Baker felt Cass nudge him as the mourners stood after the service. He leaned over and whispered their accuracy. He pointed to Hank in the crowd. As people left the pews, the two investigators caught Hank before he could leave. Baker immediately saw Hank's body tense up as they blocked his path. He seemed ready to flee. Baker cut to the chase. His eyes widened when he said, "Hank, we need you to come with us and answer some questions." He shook his head and said, "No way." "Not without my lawyer." He pushed past them and left the church. Baker and Cass didn't oppose him. They looked at each other. They considered Hank their main suspect due to his bizarre, evasive behavior. 5 weeks passed. State Trooper Kevin Baker sat in Detective Cass's office mid-April 2006. He carefully held a single sheet of paper in latex gloves. The ransom note looked like a movie prop. The page was covered with carefully cut and pasted newspaper letters. The letters warned, "Close business now, or more family will die." They received the note from Mike Jr.'s mother, Pat. She said it arrived in their mail that morning. For the Zametti family, this letter was terrifying. It wasn't just a cruel reminder of their son's murder, it threatened more violence. The note meant something else to Baker. They desperately needed a lead. Mike and Chester were killed over a month ago, and the investigation had stalled. Most of their initial suspects had been eliminated by this point, including Hank Jennings. They discovered his strange funeral behavior wasn't guilt-related. His settlement with the Zamittis included a non-disclosure agreement, so he was afraid of legal trouble if he told the police. His alibi was solid when they finally got him to sit down for a formal interview with his lawyer. His employer confirmed that he was at work during the murders. Hank owned several shotguns, but none were 1.6 gauge, the type used in the murders. Hank joined the growing pile of suspects. Michelle was in that pile. Given her affair, she had a motive, but she cooperated throughout the investigation. They couldn't find any evidence she was involved, directly or by hiring someone. A seemingly unbreakable alibi cleared her ex-lover, Sean Fitzpatrick, the most suspicious. He could not have been in two places. This threatening, ransom-style note seemed to confirm the investigation's initial theory that the murders were business-related and mob-related. Cass, a local, told Baker that rumors were spreading. Wakefield agreed that the mob theory made the most sense due to the Zamides' Big Dig involvement. Baker wasn't convinced. They repeatedly examined the Zamides' financial records and found no shady deals or mob ties. Additionally, this note felt wrong. A newspaper clipping note was silly and performative, not professional organization style. It seemed like someone was trying to make them think it was the mob to derail the investigation. Even if it was a red herring, the note was shocking. Because the sender may have left fingerprints or DNA on it, Baker carefully placed the note in an evidence bag. Cass sent it to the crime lab for analysis. Baker expected lab results to take time. While they waited, he re-interviewed every suspect and witness in case they missed a small, seemingly insignificant detail. Baker sat alone at Cass's desk a few days later, reading a witness statement for the 100th time. New evidence had re-energized the investigation, and he felt optimistic for the first time in weeks. They received preliminary forensic results from the threatening letter. Better yet, the lab found DNA and a partial palm print on the paper. Now, they needed a suspect to match it. The office door flew open, and an excited Detective Cass barged in. He had news after hanging up the phone. About Sean Fitzpatrick's alibi. The neighbor who walked every morning at 9 a.m. called the station. She wanted to modify her statement. She wasn't sure she saw Sean at 9. She thought she saw him later in the day after thinking about it. One phone call changed everything. A seemingly solid alibi had collapsed. Instantly, the murder day timeline was open. Sean could now have driven from Freedom to Wakefield, murdered, and returned. After realizing this, the investigators remembered another thing. The condolence cards on Michelle's coffee table came to mind. Baker and Cass walked up Michelle Zamides' front steps an hour later. Knocked on her door. They asked for permission to enter and retrieve a small object from her home when she answered. As usual, Michelle agreed, confused but cooperative. After passing her, they found the condolence card they were looking for in that pile. The card was from Sean Fitzpatrick. They thanked Michelle, carefully placed the card and envelope in an evidence bag, and left. The crime lab received it directly. When the test results came back, Baker and Cass knew they had solved the case. Police believe this happened on the 13th of March 2006, based on the new timeline, DNA evidence, and witness statements. Sean Fitzpatrick silently climbed Mike Zamides' office's metal staircase at 7:45 a.m. He carried a 1.6 gauge shotgun and had a racing heart. He was anxious but determined. His mind told him Mike Jr. must go. The only way, he entered the office without hesitation. It opened, and he raised the shotgun. Mike sat at his desk. He turned when the door opened and saw his neighbor, his wife's ex-lover, with a gun pointed at him, shocking and confusing him. Sean shot Mike in the face and chest before he could react. Mike sank in his chair, dead. Sean ran down the stairs, adrenaline rushing. However, he froze at the bottom of the stairs. He heard outside footsteps approaching the building's side door. Others were coming. Sean instinctively hid in the shadows of the large garage, his mind racing to see who it was. A man entered shortly after the door opened. It was Chester Roberts. Sean jumped out of his hiding spot and shot Chester in the back before he could react. Chester fell silently. Sean stood stunned for a moment. He hadn't intended to kill again. Mike alone was targeted. Now another body lay on the floor. He couldn't stay. More people may arrive at any time. He ran from the building and jumped into the green pickup truck he stole from a Freedom neighbor who was away. He left the Allstate concrete parking lot in under 10 minutes. He drove with white-knuckled steering wheel grip. He felt terrible about what he did and knew he should feel guilty. However, he only felt profound relief. Now, he believed he could be with his soulmate. When Michelle tried to break up with Sean, she told him she would only leave her husband if Mike did or suffered. Michelle did it to end the affair and let him down easy. Sean saw it as a suggestion and green light. So he did something to Mike. The pieces fell into place after Sean's alibi collapsed. He licked the envelope of his condolence card to Michelle, leaving DNA that matched the ransom-style letter. Sean wrote and sent that letter to deceive the police into thinking the murders were a professional mob hit. June 2006 saw Sean Fitzpatrick arrested. After being convicted of murdering Michael Zamiti Jr. and Chester Roberts, he received 2 life sentences. The Zamiti family had to deal with the loss of their son and the betrayal of a friend. Chester Roberts' family mourned an innocent man who was killed for arriving on time to work. Many thanks for watching. Comment your thoughts on today's episode. And remember, you can binge on our true crime playlist right now. Till next time. See you. It was a cold afternoon in the winter of 2015, and 57-year-old Patricia Duray was asleep on her couch inside her home in France. She had the day off from her job as a reporter for a local radio station, and she decided to spend it relaxing, just watching a movie. But at some point, she'd clearly drifted off. The sound that woke her was the familiar ding of her cell phone. Patricia slowly opened her eyes, feeling groggy and a bit disoriented. She blinked a few times, letting her living room come back into focus. The movie was still playing quietly on the television, the credits rolling. She must have been out for a while. She reached over to the coffee table and picked up her phone to see who had messaged her. The screen lit up showing a new text, but it was from a number she didn't have saved in her contacts. She tapped on the notification, and the message that appeared on her screen was strange, to say the least. It read in French, "The castle wants you. The castle is calling you. Come." For a moment, Patricia just stared at the words, completely baffled. It made no sense at all. It sounded like something out of a bad horror movie. She scrolled up, and that's when she saw there were other messages in the thread from this same number, messages she had received months ago. And in that instant, she remembered exactly who this was. The person sending these cryptic texts was a middle-aged woman named Bérengère. About 8 months before this, Bérengère had approached Patricia while she was out in public. She had seemed frantic, telling Patricia that she was in desperate need of her help. The reason, Bérengère had explained, was that she worked in a castle, and that castle was haunted. Now, for most people, this would be a very strange request to receive from a stranger. But for Patricia, it wasn't entirely out of the ordinary. You see, in addition to being a well-respected local news reporter, Patricia Duray was also a self-proclaimed psychic medium. She genuinely believed she had the ability to communicate with the dead, and it was a part of her life she was very passionate about. In fact, she was quite famous for it throughout France. Because of her public profile, both as a journalist and as a medium, she attracted a lot of attention. People would often come to her with stories of paranormal activity. They'd claim their house was haunted, that they'd seen a ghost, or that strange things were happening that they couldn't explain. Patricia always tried to approach these situations with an open mind, but she was also a pragmatist. She knew that most of the time there was a perfectly logical explanation. More often than not, when she would follow up on these claims, she'd discover that the ghostly whispers were just drafty windows, the footsteps in the attic were the house settling, and the eerie shadow was just a trick of the light. There were rarely any actual spirits to communicate with. So, the vast majority of the time, when someone approached her with a story about a haunting, she took it with a grain of salt. When Bérengère had first come to her 8 months ago, talking about a haunted castle, Patricia's internal reaction was basically, sure it is. She was polite, of course, but she didn't really believe it. Bérengère, however, had been very persistent. She was clearly distressed and desperate for help. So, mostly just to be kind and to end the conversation, Patricia had given the woman her phone number. Almost immediately after, Bérengère had sent her a couple of texts, but Patricia had intentionally ignored them, filing it away as just another likely dead end. But now, 8 months later, here was Bérengère again, texting her with this bizarre and dramatic message about a castle calling for her. For some reason, this time, it was different. Maybe it was the strange wording of the text, or maybe it was just the fact that Patricia had a rare day off with nothing else to do. Whatever it was, her interest was piqued. She found herself feeling a strange sense of inspiration, a little pull of curiosity. She decided she would actually follow up on this one. She was going to go check out this castle and see for herself what this supposed haunting was all about. About an hour and a half later, Patricia's car pulled up in front of a small, charming cottage. The cottage was situated on the same large property as the castle. From her earlier brief text exchange with Berenger, she knew this was where the woman lived. Patricia parked her car, got out, and walked up the stone path to the front door. She knocked firmly, then waited. There was no answer. The air was still and quiet. After a few moments of silence, she knocked again, this time a little louder. A moment later, the door creaked open. But the person standing in the doorway was not Berenger. It was a middle-aged man, and he looked completely confused to see a stranger standing on his doorstep. The look on his face was one of pure bewilderment. Seeing his confusion, Patricia immediately launched into an explanation. She said, "Hello, I'm looking for Berenger. I'm Patricia. We were just speaking via text message." The man just continued to stare at her, his expression not changing. He seemed to have no idea what she was talking about. It was an awkward and uncomfortable moment. But then, from behind the man, Berenger appeared. As soon as Berenger saw who was at the door, her entire demeanor changed. Her face flooded with relief, and her eyes welled up with tears. She looked like she was about to start weeping with joy. She rushed forward, pushing past the man. "Oh my gosh, thank you so much for coming," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "This is unbelievable. Thank you. We really need your help." Before Patricia could even ask a question or get a word in, Berenger gestured towards the confused man who had opened the door. By now, his expression had softened a little, though he still looked a bit lost. "This is my husband, Remy," Berenger said. "And he is just as relieved as I am that you're here." At this, Patricia offered the man a polite smile and shook his hand. She turned back to them both and said, "Well, I don't know yet what I can do for you. Why don't you start from the beginning and fill me in? All I really know is that you believe the castle over there is haunted. Can you tell me the story?" Berenger took a moment to compose herself, wiping a tear from her eye. She took a deep breath and then began to explain. About a year ago, her husband, Remy, had been hired as the full-time caretaker for the historic castle on the property. As part of the job, they were given free housing in this very cottage. She had come along to help him with the upkeep. At first, she said, they were both thrilled. It was a wonderful opportunity, a beautiful place to live, and a steady job for Remy. But their excitement didn't last long. Berenger told Patricia that they had only been living and working there for a couple of weeks when the strange things started to happen. She explained that she would often be in the castle by herself, doing her daily chores like cleaning or dusting. She would know for a fact that she was the only person inside the huge, empty building. And yet, she would suddenly hear the clear and unmistakable sound of footsteps, people walking, and sometimes even running around on the floors above her. At this point in the story, Remy chimed in, speaking for the first time. He said, "Yes, I've heard it too. I've heard those same footsteps, and I know the castle is totally empty." He looked at Patricia with wide, earnest eyes. "But it's even stranger than that," he continued. He said he would be working inside the castle and he would hear voices. And he wasn't talking about faint whispers that you might hear in a movie. No, he would hear people screaming at the top of their lungs. The screams would come from distant, unseen parts of the castle, and he said it was absolutely terrifying. As Patricia listened to Remy and Berenger tell their story, she was struck by how genuinely frightened they were. They weren't being dramatic or trying to sensationalize anything. It was clear that whatever they had experienced inside that castle had deeply shaken them. They seemed trapped. Remy's job required him to be there, to go inside the castle every day, but it was becoming an increasingly difficult and stressful ordeal for both of them. They felt like they had nowhere to turn and that no one would take them seriously. Patricia couldn't help but feel a sense of empathy for them. They came across as honest, ordinary people who were caught in an extraordinary and frightening situation. But at the same time, her professional skepticism was still there. She was a veteran in these matters. She had been on numerous house calls to supposedly haunted locations. She knew that screams could be the sound of the wind whistling through a crack in a window, and footsteps could be a raccoon in the attic or a pet walking around somewhere else in the house. There could easily be a rational explanation for everything they were describing, but their fear was so palpable, so real, that she knew it warranted a closer look. There was enough here to convince her that she needed to see the castle for herself. So, after they finished their story, she looked at them both and said, "Okay, let's go over there. Let's go see the castle." A few minutes later, Patricia was following Berenger and Remy along a wooded path that led from their cottage to the castle. Even from a distance, the castle was an imposing sight. It was huge and intimidating, with two very tall round towers on either end. In the middle was a slightly shorter section, decorated with a cluster of smaller turrets that reached up towards the gray sky. The front of the castle, the side they were approaching, only had two visible windows. For a fleeting second, as Patricia looked up at them, she had an uneasy feeling that the windows were like two giant eyes, and the castle itself was watching her approach. She quickly shook the feeling off, telling herself not to get carried away, and kept walking. A few moments later, they arrived at the castle's massive front door, which was made of thick, dark wood. Remy pulled out a huge, old-fashioned key ring that was heavy with dozens of keys. He found the right one, inserted it into the lock, and turned it with a loud, metallic clank. Then he pushed the heavy door open and stepped aside, gesturing for Patricia to go inside first. Patricia took a steadying breath, trying her best to remain professional and objective. She was not going to buy into the hype just yet. This could still be something completely normal. But as she stepped over the threshold and into the castle, she found herself in an enormous, empty space known as the Great Hall. The first thing she noticed was how incredibly dark and cold it was inside. Of course, it was an old stone castle, so a certain level of cold was to be expected. But this felt different. It was an eerie, penetrating cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. The air itself felt heavy, thick, with a kind of oppressive silence. It was not a welcoming place. It was the kind of place that made you want to turn around and leave immediately. Patricia took another deep breath, trying to center herself and focus on the task at hand. She looked around the Great Hall more closely. There were a few windows on the far wall, but their heavy wooden shutters were all closed tight, plunging the room into shadow. Directly in front of her was a grand, sweeping stone staircase that led up to the upper floors. To her right and to her left, she could see long, dark hallways that she knew must lead to dozens of other rooms. After a few moments of just taking it all in, Patricia turned to Berenger. She said, "Okay, so you mentioned you've heard footsteps upstairs when you knew this place was empty. Can you remember what you were doing on any of those occasions? What were you doing the last time you heard the sounds?" Berenger thought for a second and then nodded. "Actually, yes, I do remember," she said. "The last time it happened, I was closing the shutters on those windows over there. And I know I heard people walking around upstairs while I was doing that." Instantly, Patricia's practical mind went to work. That could be it. Maybe the sound of the old heavy shutters moving was creating some kind of echo or vibration that in this cavernous space could be mistaken for footsteps. It was a plausible theory. "Okay," Patricia said, "let's go test the shutters. Let's just see if that could be causing the strange sounds you're hearing." Berenger and Remy didn't seem offended by her suggestion at all. In fact, they seemed eager to find a rational explanation for what was happening. They wanted it to be something simple. So, the three of them walked over to one of the large windows. Patricia reached out, grabbed the wooden handles of the shutters, and pulled them open. Then she pushed them closed. She did this a few more times, listening carefully. But there were no strange sounds. There was the creak of the old wood and the thud as they closed, but certainly nothing that could be confused with the sound of footsteps running around upstairs. It was a dead end. This was not the explanation. Still, just to be thorough, Patricia decided she would try one of the other shutters. Maybe one of them was faulty or made a different noise. She walked over to the next window and reached for the shutter. But before her hand even made contact with the wood, a loud, sudden, high-pitched shrieking sound echoed through the entire castle. It seemed to come from somewhere high above them on one of the upper floors. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped, and the castle was plunged back into a deadly, unnerving silence. Immediately, the hairs on the back of Patricia's neck stood on end. It was an unmistakable sound, a human-like shriek of terror or pain. She turned to look at Remy and Berenger. They were both frozen, their faces pale with fear. They had obviously heard things like this before, but it was clear that it was just as terrifying every single time. Patricia stood there for a moment, her heart pounding, not sure what to do next. She forced herself to stay calm. Wait a minute, she told herself silently. That couldn't have been what it sounded like. There has to be a logical explanation. Part of the reason for her skepticism was that even in all her years as a psychic medium, she had never experienced anything so direct, so visceral. A ghostly scream was something you saw in movies, not something that happened in real life. So she turned to the terrified couple and said in a calm voice, "Look, I obviously heard that too. But let's not rule out that it could have been the wind or something else. Let's not jump to conclusions here. Let's be rational, let's be pragmatic. Let's just search the castle and see what we're dealing with." Remy and Berenger did not look reassured in the slightest, but they nodded meekly, willing to follow her lead. But before anyone could move, before anyone could even take a step, it happened again. Another sudden, loud, high-pitched scream ripped through the silence, this time from a different location upstairs. It sounded like a different voice. And then, once again, it was gone, leaving only a ringing in their ears and a thick, heavy silence. At that moment, it became very clear to Patricia and certainly to the couple that this was not the wind. The castle might just be haunted after all. There was something very wrong happening here. As Patricia stood there, trying to process what was happening and figure out what their next move should be, because she was now, by default, the expert in charge, a powerful and strange feeling came over her. She would later describe it as a pull, like a magnet was inside her, pulling her in the direction of where the screams had come from. She felt an overwhelming and undeniable urge to go upstairs, to the second floor, to find the source of those sounds. She felt like she had to. It wasn't a conscious decision, it was a compulsion. She wasn't even sure if it was her own psychic abilities kicking in, or if it was the castle itself drawing her deeper into its shadows. Without saying a word to Remy and Berenger, without even a glance in their direction, Patricia silently turned and began to walk, almost as if against her will, towards the huge stone staircase that led to the upper levels. The castle was now completely silent again. The only sound was the soft echo of their own footsteps on the stone floor as they moved towards the stairs. Remy and Berenger, their faces masks of terror, huddled closely behind Patricia, following her lead, not knowing what else to do. Up the stairs they went. Patricia was still in the grip of that intense feeling, that pull that she couldn't control. Up and up the stone steps she climbed, with the frightened couple close behind. No one spoke. The only sound was their breathing and the scuff of their shoes on the stone. They went all the way up to the third floor, which is where she felt the screams had most likely originated. At the top of the stairs, Patricia, acting almost on instinct, turned to her left and started walking down a long, dark hallway. The hallway was lined with closed doors on either side. Again, the castle was unnervingly quiet. All they could hear was the sound of their own footsteps echoing in the narrow space. Down the long hallway they walked, all the way to a dead end. and at the very end of the hallway, there was a single closed door. At this point, Patricia, almost as if she were a different person, turned and spoke to Remy in a sharp, almost aggressive tone. "Get your keys out," she commanded. "Open this door." She didn't even know why she was being so forceful. The words just came out of her. Bérengère, however, spoke up, her voice trembling. "The owner of the castle," she whispered. "They told us this is the one room we are not allowed to go in. We've never been inside. We can't go in there." Patricia just looked at her, her expression unyielding. "I don't care," she said, her voice firm. "We have to go in. Open the door. I'm going in. I have to go in this room." Bérengère looked at her husband, her eyes wide with fear and uncertainty. Remy just gave a slight shrug. They were in way over their heads and had no idea what to do. They figured they had to trust Patricia. She was the expert after all. So Remy pulled out his big ring of keys again. He fumbled through them, his hands shaking slightly, trying to find the right one. Patricia stood there, practically vibrating with the need to get into that room. She couldn't understand the feeling, but it was all-consuming. Finally, Remy found the key. He reached out, put it in the lock, and turned it. He pushed the door open, and Patricia immediately walked inside. As the door swung open, Remy and Bérengère got their first look inside the forbidden room. And it was completely unremarkable. It was just a vacant, empty room. There was no furniture, no decorations, nothing at all. There was no obvious reason why this specific room would be off-limits. But as they stood in the doorway and watched Patricia walk slowly and methodically to the center of the room, they could have sworn they heard the faint sound of whispers suddenly starting up inside the empty space. Patricia came to a stop in the very middle of the room, her back facing them. And then things got even stranger. Patricia, who was now acting very differently from the calm professional who had first arrived, just stood there, rigid, staring towards the back wall of the dark room as the whispers seemed to grow louder. From their vantage point in the doorway, Bérengère and Remy watched in horror as Patricia's body began to twitch. Her shoulders moved in jerky, unnatural ways, and her neck snapped to the side at a strange angle. And then she began to let out a horrible, croaking sound. It was a constant, single-tone, guttural noise. It went on and on for so long that it seemed impossible. She should have needed to take a breath to continue, but she didn't. The sound just emanated from her, relentless and unsettling. Remy and Bérengère were now terrified, not of the castle, but of Patricia. As she was twitching and croaking, she suddenly stopped, whipped around, and faced them. Her mouth was hanging open, her jaw completely slack, and that awful croaking sound was still coming out of her. But they could also see that she was weeping. Tears were streaming down her face. Remy and Bérengère were beyond terrified, but they could also see that Patricia was in some kind of crisis, and they wanted to help. They were just about to ask her what was wrong, what they could do, when a loud slamming sound echoed up from one of the lower floors. It sounded like a heavy door had been slammed shut with incredible force. The noise seemed to snap Patricia out of whatever trance she was in. Her expression changed in an instant. She became focused, alert. And then, without a word to the couple, she bolted right past them, sprinted out of the room, and ran down the hallway and down the stairs. She was chasing after the sound. Remy and Bérengère looked at each other, stunned. What else could they do but follow her? So they ran down the hallway, several paces behind Patricia, who was already somewhere on a lower floor. They got down to the second floor and could hear movement coming from one of the rooms down the hall. Then they heard a loud, almost animalistic yelling sound. It seemed to be Patricia, yelling or growling or something from inside one of the rooms. They cautiously made their way in that direction and saw an open door that led into a bedroom. Off of the bedroom was a small bathroom. They went into the bedroom and looked into the bathroom. And there was Patricia. Her back was to them, and she was on her knees, weeping uncontrollably. She was looking up at something in the room, something they couldn't see. They could see her face from an angle, and it was contorted in pure horror. She was looking at something that was terrifying her, but to them, the bathroom was completely empty. Remy and Berenger didn't hesitate. They rushed into the bathroom and grabbed Patricia. She seemed to resist, not wanting to leave, but they were stronger. They dragged her out of the bathroom, pulled her to her feet, and literally, forcibly, removed her from the castle out into the fresh air. Several hours later, Berenger and Remy were back inside their cozy cottage. They were sitting in their living room, with stacks of old papers and historical documents scattered all over their coffee table. Sitting with them was Patricia. By this point, she was mostly back to her normal self, but she was still visibly shaken by what had happened inside the castle. She was now able to explain to the couple what she had experienced from her perspective. She told them that she had, in fact, gone into a kind of trance, a psychic medium experience unlike any she had ever had before. This was on a completely different level. It was visceral and terrifyingly real. According to Patricia, when she had walked into that locked, forbidden room on the third floor, the room was not empty for her. When she was pulled in there, what she saw was a room filled with people, entities, or ghosts. Berenger and Remy couldn't see them, but Patricia could. She said they were all wearing different kinds of clothes, from different time periods. There were people dressed in medieval peasant outfits, women in Victorian dresses, and men in 20th century business suits. But the most powerful impression she got was not their appearance, but their emotional state. She could feel how lost and scared these spirits were. They seemed to be in trouble. Patricia said she felt like she was pulled into the center of the room and then anchored there, unable to move. As she stood there, these ghosts began to crowd in on her, getting closer and closer, as if they were desperately trying to get her help. She felt overcome by a suffocating, claustrophobic feeling. It wasn't their physical presence that was overwhelming her, it was their sadness. Their collective loneliness and desperation washed over her in waves, and it was so powerful and so awful that it made her weep uncontrollably. Eventually, she said, she was able to force her body to turn around and at least look towards the exit. That's when she heard the loud slamming door from downstairs. The sudden noise seemed to startle the spirits, and they backed away from her, which gave her the chance to bolt from the room. Patricia then explained that when she ran out and started heading in the direction of the slammed door, the feeling of being pulled was very different. The pull that had led her up to the third floor had felt neutral, maybe even positive, like something was guiding her to help. But this new pull, leading her down to the second floor, felt totally different. It was dark. She knew that something evil was pulling her towards it. But still, almost against her own will, she ran down the hallway, down the stairs, and into that bedroom, with Berenger and Remy following behind. When she went into the bathroom, she saw something so terrifying that she just collapsed to her knees and began to scream. That was the animalistic wailing that the couple had heard. What she saw was an enormous, tall, Guzek figure. It was the ghost of a man, covered in deep scars, wearing rusted chainmail armor, like a knight from a long-forgotten time. She said he radiated pure evil. It was a dark, malevolent presence. She knew that was the source of the dark feeling that had pulled her there. She felt like it was trying to pull her to her death, and she believes that it was only because Remy and Berenger came in and physically pulled her away that she was able to escape. After Patricia finished her incredible story, the three of them sat in silence, trying to process what had just happened. They had to figure out what it all meant. They quickly decided to focus on the most immediate threat, the evil entity, the tall man in the rusted armor. Who was he? And what did he want? Berenger and Remy had already gathered up a bunch of historical documents about the castle, and they had spread them out on the coffee table. Together, they started going through them, looking for any clue that might explain who this terrifying spirit could be. As they were looking through the old papers, one particular section caught Patricia's eye. She felt a strange pull towards it, a feeling that she needed to read it. It was a section about a knight named Jean who had lived in the 14th century. The document said that Jean had been a soldier during the 100 Years' War, a long and brutal conflict between England and France. During that war, the castle had been used as a French military fortress, and Jean, the knight, had been killed in a battle that took place right there at the castle. After Patricia read this out loud, she told Berenger and Remy that she just had a feeling. She couldn't explain why, but she was certain that the evil spirit she had seen in the bathroom, the tall man in the armor, was the ghost of Jean. However, even if she was right, it didn't solve their problem. They still didn't know why he was there, why he had appeared to her, or why any of this was happening, and who were all the other ghosts in the room on the third floor. None of it made any more sense. Berenger eventually looked at Patricia and asked, "What do you think all this means? What do we do?" But Patricia was still deeply shaken. She was a renowned psychic, but she had never experienced anything this intense. It was truly terrifying. She just shook her head and said, "Look, I'm overwhelmed. I need to go home. I need to go home and just think about all of this. I need to process what happened here." Remy and Berenger were obviously disappointed, and probably terrified at the thought of being left alone with the haunted castle, but they understood. They couldn't force her to stay. So, Patricia got up and left, leaving them alone with their fear. After she was gone, Berenger and Remy made a pact. They agreed that even though it was Remy's job to look after the castle, it was just too dangerous to go inside for now. They would stay away, at least until Patricia came back and they could figure out what to do. For the next couple of days, life was surprisingly normal for them. As long as they stayed away from the castle, nothing strange happened at all. They just lived in their cottage and tried to go about their lives. But Patricia didn't call, and she didn't come back. She was at her own home, trying to come to terms with her terrifying experience. And during this time, Berenger started to feel a strange sensation in her chest. It was a feeling of needing to go to the castle. It was a pull, very similar to what Patricia had described. She tried to ignore it, to fight it, but the feeling just grew stronger. She felt this undeniable compulsion to go over there. Then one day, Remy was looking out the window of their cottage, and he saw his wife, Berenger, walking purposefully across the lawn, straight towards the front door of the castle. He knew immediately what was happening. He thought there's no way she should be going in there. We agreed. He ran out of the cottage, raced over to her, and literally grabbed her and pulled her back just moments before she could go inside. When he pulled her away, she seemed to snap out of it, and she couldn't even explain why she was there. She just said, "I don't know. I just felt like I had to come over here." But that wasn't even the strangest thing that happened in those few days. Shortly after that incident, a random man had wandered onto the castle grounds. He didn't seem to know why he was there, but he too was being drawn towards the castle. As this man was walking towards the front door, a deer, which also seemed to be drawn to the castle, came running out of the woods and rammed into the man with incredible force. He was injured so badly that he had to be hospitalized, and he actually lost an eye in the incident. After this happened, Berenger and Remy knew they couldn't wait any longer. They had been trying to give Patricia her space, but things were escalating. The dark energy in the castle seemed to be getting stronger, its influence spreading. They had to get in touch with her. Berenger called Patricia and told her everything that had happened. She said, "Whatever's going on in that castle, whatever dark energy is in there, it's getting stronger." At first, Patricia was not eager to return. She had made a conscious decision to stay away. The experience had terrified her, and she didn't want any part of it. But as she listened to Berenger on the phone, she could hear the sheer desperation in her voice. Berenger and Remy were at their wits' end. They were lost, and they were turning to her not just as a psychic, but as a friend. They needed her help. So, reluctantly, Patricia agreed to go back. The following evening, the three of them were back inside the castle. They were standing in the second-floor bathroom, the very same room where Patricia had encountered the terrifying entity she now believed was the ghost of Jean. Patricia had come back to attempt an exorcism. She stood in the middle of the small bathroom, while Berenger and Remy huddled together behind her near the doorway. Berenger was so scared she was physically shaking. They watched as Patricia, despite her own fear, stood there calmly with her eyes closed. She was trying to channel the energy in the room to connect with the spirit of John. After a few moments of silent concentration, Patricia seemed to connect with something that Berenger and Remy couldn't see. The room was empty to them, but it was clear that Patricia had found what she was looking for. Then, out of nowhere, her voice boomed through the small bathroom, loud and stern. "Jean, show yourself." Berenger and Remy stared at her, their hearts pounding. Patricia opened her eyes and looked around the room, and then her gaze locked onto something on the other side of the bathroom. She could clearly see something that they couldn't. Patricia, her eyes still fixed on whatever was in the room with them, spoke again in that same loud, commanding voice. "It's over," she said. "You have to move on." She was speaking directly to the entity, to Jean, telling him that his time was up. For a long moment, there was just silence. Berenger and Remy held their breath, waiting to see what would happen. Was Patricia going to go into another trance? But she remained calm, forceful, and anchored to the spot. Nothing happened. It was completely silent. Then Patricia repeated her command, her voice even stronger this time. "It's over. You have to move on." And this time, after she spoke, they all heard it. The sound of banging on a door coming from the third floor directly above them. Then they heard the sound of shuffling footsteps, dozens of them, all over the place. And then the sound of mournful crying. There was more banging. Berenger and Remy clutched each other, terrified. But Patricia remained unmoved, a rock in the center of the storm. And then, suddenly, they heard the distinct sound of a door flying open upstairs. This was followed by the sound of all those footsteps rushing down the hallway, mixed with the sound of crying. But the crying had changed. It was no longer sad. It sounded like blissful crying, like tears of pure joy, as a crowd of spirits charged down the hallway, down the stairs, and out of the castle forever. And then, just like that, it was over. A profound calm fell over the entire castle. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere was gone. Patricia turned away from whatever she had been looking at in the bathroom and faced Remy and Berenger. She was smiling. "It's over," she said softly. "It's okay. Everything's okay now." Patricia later explained to them what had happened. She had been able to channel the ghost of Jean. He had been haunting the castle because he didn't know he was dead. He was stuck in a kind of purgatory, believing he was still fighting the 100 Years' War. For centuries, every time someone died in or around the castle, he would take their spirit and hold it prisoner in that locked room on the third floor. But when Patricia had told him it's over, he understood that she meant the war was over. And at that moment, Jean himself was the one who freed all the prisoners. That was the sound they heard, all the spirits being released, joyful and free at last. And then Jean's own spirit was finally able to find peace and move on. But there is one final strange twist to this story. A short time after the exorcism, when life had returned to normal for everyone, Patricia and Berenger were talking on the phone. At one point in the conversation, Patricia said offhandedly, "You know, Berenger, it's a good thing you texted me again and got me to come back out there. Clearly, I was able to help." "What a good thing it was that you texted me." And Berenger replied, "What do you mean?" Patricia said, "You know, when you texted me that the castle was calling me." "You were right." "It was, and I came over and we took care of it." But Berenger was confused. She said, "I haven't texted you in months. I didn't send you that message." Patricia, surprised, pulled out her phone and found the text. She read it back to Berenger. "The castle wants you. The castle is calling you. Come." And Berenger insisted, "Yeah, I didn't send that to you." And to this day, Patricia, Berenger, and Remy still have no idea who or what sent that fateful text message to Patricia's phone. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.
In 1988, a waitress living in Central Florida had just started her shift at a local diner. She was standing in the middle of the restaurant, getting ready to take an order, when her heart just started racing like crazy. Now, she hadn't been running around or doing any heavy lifting, so it didn't make any sense at all. Startled by what was happening inside her own chest, she just turned around, walked straight into the staff bathroom, and sat down in a stall. She just wanted to wait for this strange sensation to pass. But as she sat there, her heart just continued to beat like a drum, faster and faster. And then she began to feel a strange tingling sensation in her feet, which started to crawl up into her arms. And it was at that moment that a terrifying thought crossed her mind. She realized she might be having a heart attack. Except she wasn't. Something much, much worse was happening to her. Peggy Carr's life had never been particularly easy. She was born back in 1947 in a very small rural town in Central Florida. Her parents were both deaf and had almost no money, so from a very young age, Peggy had to go to work to help support the family. But the only jobs she could find were either extremely low paying or they were just outright dangerous. She worked overnight shifts at isolated truck stops on deserted highways, often waitressing there all by herself. But Peggy never once complained about her job prospects. She just took whatever work was available because she knew her family needed the money. And whenever she was working in one of those dangerous environments, she would intentionally put on this very tough exterior. She did it to make sure no one would even think about trying to take advantage of her. And despite her small stature, she quickly developed a reputation among her coworkers as somebody you did not want to mess with. Peggy didn't take any nonsense from anybody. But while this kind of prickly outer shell protected her from potential predators, it also had a way of warding off potential romantic partners. A lot of men might have been interested in her, but they were kind of intimidated when they tried to talk to her. Eventually, one man did manage to cut through Peggy's defenses. They fell in love, got married, and they had 3 kids together. And for a while, everything was great. Until it wasn't. The marriage eventually crashed and burned, and so by the mid-1980s, Peggy was in her mid-30s, a divorced mother of 3 teenage children, and she was working overtime at a local diner just to barely make ends meet. And while she still acted very tough and composed when she was at work or out in public, when she was behind closed doors at home with her kids, they saw the real Peggy. And that side of her was just kind of sad. Life had just been hard on her, and she had tried so hard to provide a safe and happy home for her kids, and she felt like she'd kind of let them down. But her kids, on the other hand, they weren't bitter towards their mother for the divorce. It just pained them to see her so upset all the time. And so her kids really hoped that one day their mom would meet somebody new, that she would fall in love all over again, and maybe that would finally put a smile back on her face. And in late 1987, that is exactly what happened. That year, Peggy met a man named Pi R. Carr. Pi, which was his nickname, was a lot like Peggy. He was a recently divorced single father of 2 teenage children. He didn't take nonsense from anyone, and just like Peggy, he had been forced to start working at a fairly young age. When Peggy met him, he was living with his 2 kids in another tiny Central Floridian rural town called Alturas. He was the foreman of a local phosphate mining company there. Phosphate is a chemical that has a lot of industrial and consumer uses. So Peggy and Pi, they started dating, and right away, Peggy's kids noticed this huge shift in their mother. I mean, now she was all smiles, she was so happy. It seemed like Pi was the knight in shining armor that had come to save the day. And then, just a couple of months later, in April of 1988, Pi and Peggy got married, much to their children's excitement. After the marriage was finalized, Peggy and her 3 kids moved in with Pi and his 2 kids in his home in Alturas, Florida. And for a while, this newly blended family worked out perfectly. Even though they were all living in a fairly small house and all 5 teenagers were kind of on top of each other, they all got along great. It was kind of fun and chaotic to have so many people in the house all the time. The house just felt like it was bursting with life. But within a few months of Peggy and her kids moving in, Peggy and Pi started to have serious marital issues. It was like all their early chemistry had just completely vanished. And in its place was nothing but resentment. They basically couldn't stand each other, and everything one of them did seemed to upset the other person. And then, adding fuel to the fire, were rumors that began spreading around this small town where everybody knows everybody else's business. The rumor was that Pi was apparently back together with an ex-girlfriend, and so he was having an affair. Pi denied these accusations, but Peggy totally believed them. And so their fights got worse and worse and worse. The more they fought, the more a wedge was driven down the center of this blended family. Peggy's kids automatically took their mother's side, and Pi's kids automatically took their dad's side. And so from the outside looking in, it seemed plainly obvious that Pi and Peggy's marriage was not going to last. But before their marriage could officially fall apart, something totally unexpected happened that would link these two families together forever. In late October of 1988, about 7 months into Peggy and Pi's now very rocky marriage, Pi suddenly got up one morning and just told Peggy he was leaving for the whole day to go hunting. This wasn't a planned trip. He just wanted to get away. And at this point, neither of them wanted to spend any time with each other, so Peggy didn't care. She just said, "Go ahead, enjoy your trip, I'll see you later." And so Pi, he leaves the house, gets in his truck, and drives off. A little while later, Peggy and her daughter Sissy, they both get their things together and head out. They get in Peggy's car and they drive into town. Both Peggy and her daughter worked at the same diner as waitresses, and they both had a shift that morning. So they arrive at the diner, they both get out, they go inside, get their aprons on, and they begin their shift like normal. But not long into the shift, Peggy was about to walk up to one of her tables when she noticed her heart was racing. And she had not been running around the restaurant, she had not done any heavy lifting. There was absolutely no reason for her heart to suddenly be beating at a really fast clip. Initially, Peggy just tried to ignore it. She thought maybe it was just a fluke, that her heart would slow down and she would go back to normal. But when her racing heart persisted, she walked away from the table she was waiting on and snuck off into the staff bathroom. She went into one of the stalls, she shut the door, and she just sat on the toilet waiting for her heart to stop racing. But as she sat there, not only did her heart continue to thump like mad, but she started to notice her legs were tingling and so were her arms. Now, Peggy was a no-nonsense person. She was not prone to panicking or overreacting or anything like that. So as she's sitting there feeling these strange symptoms, it dawns on her that maybe, just maybe, she was having a heart attack. And so she decides, okay, I'm going to deal with this. She stands up, she opens the stall door, she goes to the sink, she washes her hands, she splashes some cold water on her face. She kind of calms herself down, and then she walks out of the bathroom. She goes right into the staff break room and she finds her daughter. She tells her, "I think I'm having a heart attack. But don't worry. I'm just going to go home. I'm going to lie down, and if this gets worse, I will go to the hospital. But for right now, I don't really know what it is, but I want to take it seriously. So I'm going to leave for the day." Her daughter, Sissy, is looking at her mom really concerned. But Sissy knows what her mom is like. Her mom is tough as nails. She is the type of person who would try to sleep off a heart attack. And so she says to her mom, "Okay, go home. I'll be sure to check on you as soon as I get back. And please call me if anything changes." And so Peggy, whose heart was still racing and whose arms and legs were still tingling, she told her daughter, everything's going to be fine. And then she told her manager that she was leaving for the day. Peggy slipped out the back door, she got in her car, and she drove back home. When she got there, the house was empty. So she just went inside, made her way to her bedroom, and she lay down in her bed to try to get some rest. That afternoon, Peggy's son, Dwayne, came home from high school. And when he walked inside, he found his mother laying down in her bed. This was very unusual for Dwayne. His mother never took naps. In fact, he could not recall a single time ever that he saw his mom napping, not even when she was sick. And so, concerned, he went into her bedroom. She was facing away from him, so he kind of gently jostled her awake. And when his mom rolled over to face him, her face was pale, she was sweating. She obviously had not been sleeping. She was gritting her teeth, and it looked like she was in a lot of pain or some sort of extreme discomfort. And he said, "Mom, geez, are you okay?" And she would say to him, "Oh no, I'm fine. I'm just sleeping something off. I got something going on. I think I have a flu or something. I don't know. I took off from work, so I'm just sleeping it off." And so Dwayne, he knows his mom is tough as nails. And if she says she's going to sleep something off, then she'll probably be just fine. So Dwayne said, "Okay, well, let me know if you need anything." And so Dwayne began to walk away. But his mother would actually call him back, and she would level with him. She would tell him that actually something is really wrong here. She said she felt like someone had poured fire down her veins, in her arms, and in her legs, and that it was excruciatingly painful. And so Dwayne is hearing his mother say this, and he knows his mother is not the type of person to complain or exaggerate or anything. She is just straight, no nonsense. And so for her to say this is the most excruciating pain she's ever been in, and she's laying in bed unable to move, he knew this was really, really serious. So Dwayne began telling his mom that she had to go to the hospital. He said, "We need to get Pi here to drive you, or we need to call an ambulance, but something needs to be done here." But despite the pain she was in, Peggy was still a little bit hesitant about it. She thought maybe she could still just sleep it off. But as they're having this kind of back and forth about what to do, Pi returned from his hunting trip. He came into the house, and right away, Dwayne ran over to him. He explained to Pi, "Hey, this is not normal. My mom never, ever acts this way. She never complains. This is really serious. You gotta take her to the hospital." But Pi would actually say, "She's fine. I'm sure she just has a fever or maybe the flu. Man, she'll sleep it off." But when he walked into the bedroom and he saw his wife looking so horrible and literally squirming in pain, he relented and said, "Okay, I'll take her to the hospital." And so Pi would have to literally carry Peggy out of the house, put her in his truck. He drove her to the hospital and then had to carry her into the hospital. And by the time Peggy was under a doctor's care, she could no longer talk. She was just moaning in agony from this excruciating pain in her limbs. Her heart was still racing, and she was nauseous, and she was vomiting. I mean, she was really spiraling, and quickly. And so after she was admitted, the doctors turned to Pi and to Dwayne and to Sissy and the other family members that had gathered, and they asked them, "Do you have any idea what could have caused this?" And they all said no. She just suddenly started feeling this way. So the doctors, who were unable to ask Peggy anything because she was in such blinding pain she couldn't even talk, they just began running her through a wide-ranging series of tests to try to figure out what was going on. But when these results began coming in, either she was negative for the thing they were testing for, or the tests just came back saying that everything was normal. So they're looking at Peggy, seeing her completely falling apart, yet none of their tests revealed anything was wrong with her. And so they were at a complete loss. They didn't know what was wrong with her. And so, without a better option, they just put Peggy into a hospital room and began monitoring her. And sure enough, after being in the hospital for 3 days, Peggy's symptoms started to come down. While she wasn't back completely to her old self, she was able to speak again, she was able to eat and drink water and move around. She was still very uncomfortable, her heart would still race periodically, and she would get fits of pain in all of her extremities, but overall, she felt like she was really improving. And so after 3 days, she was discharged from the hospital. Peggy and her family drove back to their home, and initially, everything was okay. It seemed like she was on the mend. But within 24 hours, Peggy's heart started to race again. And before long, her arms and legs felt like they were on fire all over again. Now, Peggy and her family, they knew that the doctors didn't know what this condition was, and so their immediate reaction was huge concern that Peggy was again suffering from this horrible thing. But going back to the hospital didn't really feel like the obvious first choice. In fact, the obvious first choice, at least for Peggy, was just to stay at the house and try to wait it out the same way she had waited it out at the hospital. But over the next several days, despite laying in bed and resting as much as she could, her symptoms did not get any better. They got worse and worse and worse. It got to the point where she was literally completely bedridden, and all she could do was just shake and periodically scream into her pillow from all the pain she was experiencing in her extremities. And so finally, on October 30th, which was 10 days from the first day that Peggy felt these strange symptoms at the diner, her family decided, you know what, enough is enough. She obviously is not able to just sleep off whatever this is. And so they called an ambulance, which rushed her to the hospital. And when she got there, the doctors, they remembered her from the week before. So they understood this was a bit of a mystery. But just in case, they ran the exact same battery of tests on her to see if maybe now there was some other indication of what this was. But again, all of the tests came back, and they either came back negative or inconclusive or just showed that nothing was physically wrong with her. The doctors even ran her through some tests for poison, thinking, maybe she accidentally ingested something toxic, and that's what was causing all of this. But those tests as well came back negative. And so, totally stumped, the doctors decided the only thing they could do was once again put her in a hospital room and just monitor her. And so that night, Peggy was wheeled into a room, and all night, up and down that hospital wing, people listened to the sound of Peggy screaming at the top of her lungs from the pain she was experiencing. And then, the next morning, the whole situation got even worse. Not only for Peggy, who by now was dipping in and out of consciousness, but also for the rest of her family. Because that morning, Peggy's son Dwayne and Peggy's stepson, so Pi's son Travis, they were both admitted to the same hospital for exhibiting the same symptoms as Peggy. Their hearts were racing, they were nauseous, they were vomiting, and their arms and legs were starting to tingle. And so the doctors, with nothing else to do, just ran Dwayne and Travis through all the same tests they had put Peggy through. And they all came back negative, or they came back normal. However, shortly after Dwayne and Travis had been admitted to the hospital, a neurologist who was looking after Peggy, he noticed something about her condition. And suddenly, it was like his medical training from back in college kicked in. He remembered something very specific that lined up exactly with what he was seeing in Peggy. And he suddenly realized that he knew what was going on. So he told his colleagues, and they ran out, and they got this very specialized testing kit that doctors very rarely use. It's only for this one really specific and very rare condition. And they tested Dwayne and Travis and Peggy. And sure enough, the next day, the results came back. And all three tested positive for this condition that the neurologist had guessed. And even though there was a cure for this condition, for Peggy, it was too late. Her body had been so completely ravaged that even if they administered the cure, it would not work fast enough to save her life. And so that day, the doctors went to Peggy, who, despite being on all these painkillers, was still squirming and writhing in pain and screaming into her pillow. They would tell her that she was going to die. The only thing they could do was try to make her as comfortable as possible and then try to save her boys. Not long after being told this terrible news, Peggy would slip into a coma. And then, 4 months later, on the 3rd of March 1989, Peggy's family had to make the heart-wrenching decision to pull her off life support. And at that point, she passed away. As for her 2 boys, Dwayne would remain hospitalized for 2 months and would make a full recovery. As for Travis, he would remain hospitalized for 6 months, and while he would recover, he would never walk normally again. Even though the actual medical condition that killed Peggy and nearly killed Dwayne and Travis was completely known at this point, everybody knew what it was. What nobody could figure out was why this happened. Why in the world did this happen to these people? It made no sense at all. However, shortly after Peggy's death, that mystery would actually begin to unravel in the most bizarre and totally roundabout way. There is an international organization called Mensa. It's not an acronym. It's a Latin word that roughly translates to table or mind. And this organization is a highly exclusive society for the ultra-intelligent. You literally have to prove that your IQ, which is an intelligence test, ranks in the top 2% of everybody in the entire world. And even then, you may not be smart enough to get in. And in the same town that Peggy and Pi had lived in, Alturas, Florida, there was a chapter of Mensa. And the way some of these chapters worked is they would just get together every month and do some sort of intellectually stimulating activity. And in Alturas, what that meant was the chapter would get together at some private location once a month, and they would put on what they called a murder mystery weekend. The members of this chapter would head off to some private location like an inn or a hotel or a cabin or something, and they would all role play a murder investigation. One or two of the Mensa members would come up with a very elaborate murder and a subsequent investigation, and they would assign different fake characters to each of the real Mensa members. So once they got there, they'd all find out what character they were and what they were responsible for. And then, once they got into character, which included dressing up in costumes, they would remain in character until the killer was revealed. So this activity was meant to be extremely intellectually challenging, but also it was extremely fun. The group loved these murder mystery weekends. And so with that in mind, just a couple of weeks after Peggy had passed away, so this is sometime in April of 1989, a new genius was accepted into the ranks of the Alturas Mensa chapter. Her name was Sherry Gwynn, and she was a middle-aged woman who had recently fled from Texas to Central Florida to get away from her abusive husband, who still lived in Texas. After she was accepted into the Mensa chapter, it became abundantly clear to the members that Sherry was eager to make friends. But not just any friends. She wanted to make friends with two very specific members of the Alturas Mensa chapter. And they were Diana Carr, who had no relationship to Pi Carr or his family, and Diana's husband, whose name was George Treppel. Diana was a very successful orthopedic surgeon who had her own practice in Alturas, Florida. And George was this computer programmer who had more advanced degrees than you could count. And critically, Diana and George just so happened to live right next door to Peggy and Pi's house. Even though Sherry came on really strong right away to try to become friends with Deanna and George, neither of them were fazed. The couple just figured, here's a woman who's living by herself, she's moved to a brand new area, she's run away from an abusive husband. It's no wonder she wants friends. She probably just needs some support. And so Diana and George were happy to just become her friend. The same month that Sherry was accepted into the Alturas Mensa chapter, George and Diana happened to be chosen as the people responsible for coming up with the complicated scenario that the group would act out during their murder mystery weekend that month. So George and Diana very diligently sat down and went over how to make the case as complicated as they could. And George took on the responsibility of really focusing on exactly how the victim in their fake scenario would be killed, because he was really trying to make it as difficult as he possibly could. He was trying to find the perfect murder that would be nearly impossible to solve. And so he came up with this very elaborate murder scene, and then between him and what his wife was creating, they put together this really intense and very complicated scenario that they were both very happy about. And so, a couple of days later, it was time to head out for the murder mystery weekend that George and Diana had worked so hard on. And so they went and printed off a whole bunch of those cards that would have all the information about who each of the Mensa members were going to be in this role-playing game. And there was some initial information about the murder that was committed, the so-called perfect crime that George had come up with. And so they printed all those cards out, they grabbed their costumes, they packed their stuff up, they hopped in the car, and they drove to the nearby inn where they met up with the rest of the Mensa members, which included Sherry. So they get to this inn, everybody checks in, and then afterwards, they all meet up in the lobby where George and Diana hand out their cards that have the information about the role-playing game. And so everybody's reading it and figuring out what they're going to do with their character. And everyone's also looking at the so-called perfect crime that George had come up with that he was also very proud about. And he was kind of boasting to the audience about how difficult this weekend was going to be. He really came up with the perfect crime. And so as all the members are reading their cards, Sherry would see the murder weapon used in this game, and she would become fascinated with it. She would make a point of going over to George and asking him lots and lots of questions about how he came up with this particular choice of a murder weapon and what actually happens when this is used on a person, not just in the game, but in real life. It was like Sherry had become obsessed with this exact form of murder. She was so interested in it. And George, he was immediately aware that Sherry was kind of unnaturally interested in exactly how he had come up with the scheme. But in a way, it was kind of flattering for George, because he had spent a lot of time constructing it to make it as complicated as he could. And so he indulged Sherry, and he sat there and told her everything about this particular weapon and what it does to the human body and, how you can get it and what the history of this weapon was. And the whole time, Sherry is just totally locked in. I mean, she's really focused on this particular style of murder. So that murder mystery weekend would eventually come to an end, and all the Mensa members would think it was great, and they would head home. And then, over the course of nearly a year after that, Sherry would be a near constant in George and Diana's lives. I mean, she was always around them. She always wanted to meet up with them. She was always talking to them and asking them questions and calling. And anytime she was with them, she always wanted to be with George. And when she was with George, a lot of times she would bring up that very particular murder method that he had come up with for the murder mystery weekend. And George just continued to think this was just the greatest thing. It was so flattering that she thought he was so smart that he had come up with the perfect crime. And so anytime she wanted to talk about it, he would just indulge her because it made him feel really good. And if George and Diana had seen any red flags in Sherry with her behavior towards them, they certainly didn't show it. They basically were operating under the assumption that Sherry, no matter what, was just this helpless, harmless person who had come to Central Florida, and she was trying to be their friend, and so they should try to be her friend back. But, as they would soon find out, they were very, very wrong about Sherry. In December of 1989, so roughly 8 months after George and Diana had first met Sherry, Diana decided she wanted to move her medical practice from Alturas to a neighboring town called Sebring. And the drive from where their house was in Alturas to where her new office was going to be was just far enough that it made sense for George and Diana to relocate to Sebring. And when Sherry discovered that the couple was moving, she immediately called George and said, "Please let me rent out your house. I don't have a place to stay. I've been staying with friends. I'll pay whatever rent you want." And as it happened, George and Diana had actually talked about keeping the house and renting it out. And so it was actually a pretty easy decision. They trusted Sherry. And so they said, "You know what? That's fine. You can rent out the house for a couple of months, and then we'll decide if this is a long-term solution or not." And within just a couple of hours, Sherry was on Diana and George's doorstep with a sleeping bag and a small bag of toiletries ready to go inside. And so George and Diana, they grabbed the last couple of things they needed, and then as they walked out the front door, they gave their house key to Sherry and told her, "Hey, if you need anything, just give us a call." And then George and Diana, they climbed into their car. And as soon as they had driven off and were out of view, Sherry dropped her things, she kind of looked around, and then she ran inside of the house. And just minutes later, practically the entire Alturas Police Department came crashing through that front door after Sherry. And within an hour, the police department would find something that would not only reveal the true identity of Sherry and her true intentions, but it would also reveal the truth about what happened to Peggy and her family. A couple of days before Peggy first started feeling bad, when her heart started racing and her arms and legs began tingling at the diner, a couple of days before that, someone had placed 8 Coca-Cola bottles, so full sodas, glass bottles, inside of Peggy and Pi's kitchen. And they set these 8 drinks kind of tucked away inside of a storage nook. A couple of days later, the family discovered these sodas, but they didn't think anything of it. They just figured somebody else in the family had bought them and left them in the kitchen, and so they were fair game. So before long, Peggy and the rest of her family were drinking these Cokes. But Peggy, who was notorious for loving Coca-Cola, drank way more than anybody else. Well, it would turn out all 8 of those Coca-Colas had been tampered with. They all contained a significant dose of the heavy metal called thallium. Thallium is odorless, it's colorless, it's tasteless, and even though there are very small trace amounts that naturally occur inside of our bodies, if there's even a little bit more than that inside of our bloodstream, it becomes lethal. And so when Peggy was admitted to the hospital the second time around, the same time that Dwayne and Travis were also admitted, that neurologist who was looking at Peggy, what he noticed about her condition was that her hair was starting to fall out. And that's when it clicked for him. He had this flashback to his medical training where he was taught about thallium poisoning, and one of the key symptoms was hair loss. The other symptom was extreme pain in the extremities. And so the neurologist and his colleagues went and got a thallium test kit, and they tested Dwayne and Travis and Peggy, and they all came back positive for thallium poisoning. But the level of thallium inside of them was astronomical. The boys were lucky to have survived. They had 20,000 times the amount that naturally occurs inside of the human body. As for Peggy, she had an astounding 50,000 times the amount that naturally occurs, way more than was lethal. And so that was why the doctors told her, there's nothing we can do, your body is basically already dead, you're just technically still alive right now. And so the rest of the family, besides Dwayne and Travis, would also test for thallium, and they would all, with the exception of one child, have elevated levels of thallium. However, compared to Dwayne, Travis, and Peggy, of course, their conditions were negligible and they would all make full recoveries. And so the doctors realized fairly early on that this family had been poisoned. And so they contacted the police, who launched an investigation. And right away, their primary suspect was Pi. He and Peggy had been fighting extensively before she fell ill. He also had that kind of abrupt hunting trip that lined up with the day Peggy started feeling sick. And so they're thinking, okay, well, did that have something to do with how he planted the thallium? And then also, there was the fact that Pi worked at the phosphate mining company and so had access to fairly rare chemicals. However, upon closer inspection, Pi did not have access to thallium specifically. Thallium is incredibly rare and very expensive. And it just seemed odd that he would use thallium to poison and kill his wife, but he would also poison himself and his son, who he adored. It just didn't really add up. And so Pi would get ruled out as a suspect fairly quickly. But during one of his last interrogations, he would give the police something he didn't think was very valuable, but it wound up being very significant. He would say that 3 months before Peggy got sick, their family received a death threat. He opened the mail one day, and there was this typed out note that said their family needed to leave Florida in the next 2 weeks or they were all going to die. But Pi thought it was some stupid teenage prank, and so he didn't think anything of it. And then when 2 weeks went by and they weren't dead, he just kind of forgot about it. And so after the police had ruled Pi out as a suspect, they didn't know where to turn. They had no other suspects. And so they just began focusing on who might have written this note. And that's where Sherry comes in. Sherry Gwynn was not a Texas transplant who had come to Central Florida to run away from her abusive husband. Sherry Gwynn wasn't even her real name. Her real name was Susan Gorick, and she had lived in Central Florida for most of her life. Susan was very smart, but she certainly was not Mensa-level genius smart. And so almost certainly her paperwork that got her into the Alturas Mensa chapter was forged. Susan also had absolutely no interest in becoming real friends with Diana and George. The only reason she was pretending to be their friend and wanting to be around them all the time is because she was studying them. Because Susan was actually an undercover police officer. She had been sent undercover after the police discovered Diana and George were responsible for that death threat letter that was sent to Peggy and Pi. It would turn out Diana and George hated Peggy, Pi, and their kids. They hated them. They thought they were obnoxious, they were too noisy, they were annoying. And so Diana, who for context was the type of person who would stop people mid-sentence and correct them if they ever referred to her as anything other than doctor. She had gotten into at least one or two serious yelling fights with Peggy and with Pi and their kids when she had gone over to tell them to turn their music down and be quiet and do this and do that. And Peggy and Pi, they're not putting up with that. They just told her to get out of here. As for George, he didn't get into any public altercations with Peggy and Pi and their family. George was a very meek and submissive guy. He was very meager, and he was mostly a recluse. But he spent virtually all day peering out the window at Peggy and Pi and their family, studying what they were doing and obsessing over how noisy and obnoxious they were. And as he's seeing his wife getting more and more frustrated with their neighbors, George finally decides he's going to take drastic action. And so that's when George types out that death threat and he sends it across the way. But after Pi reads it, nothing happens. They don't leave Florida within 2 weeks. And so George went to phase 2 of his plan. George had actually spent time in a federal prison in the 1970s for cooking meth. And one of the byproducts of making meth is thallium. So George used his old meth cooking skills and he whipped up some thallium and he put lethal doses of thallium in 8 different Coca-Cola bottles. And then after mixing them all up so you couldn't tell there was any chemical inside of them, he used his bottle capping machine to put tops back on top of each of them. George made his own beer, and so that's why he had a capping machine at his house. And so, with his 8 deadly drinks all prepared, looking like brand new Coca-Colas, George waited until Peggy and Pi and her family were out of their house, and then he snuck over and he walked into their kitchen and he placed these Coca-Colas right down on a kitchen counter and he slid them into a storage nook, and then he left the house. And that was it. And over the next several weeks, he watched with absolute pleasure as the family got sick and then Peggy died. While George never actually admitted that he had poisoned his neighbors, he did do some things that really tipped off Susan that he had to be the guy. Like, for example, that Mensa mystery murder weekend. The murder method that George had come up with was poisoning. And remember, at that point, Susan has been sent undercover to find out if George and Diana are responsible for poisoning their neighbors. And now George is sitting up there talking about the perfect crime he's come up with, and it's poisoning. And so that was why she had followed up with him really specifically on, wow, what else do you know about poisoning, and how did you learn about poisoning, and what kind of poisons do you know about? And over the following months, even though Susan never got George to actually admit to her when she was undercover recording him that he was the poisoner, she did completely earn his trust. And she did this by always making sure she was very submissive around him and always made sure to stroke his ego and remind him how smart he was. I mean, George was used to being in a relationship with Diana, who was extremely overbearing and kind of kept him under her thumb. And so Susan kind of allowed George to feel like he was in control for once, and he loved it. And so he completely trusted Susan to the point where when he and Diana were going to move out of Alturas, they were willing to rent their house to Susan. And this is important because the house had not actually been emptied. A lot of their things were still in the house, including George's things. And so he just assumed Susan would never go through his things. But as soon as Susan was in that house and she watched George and Diana drive off, she immediately called in backup. The police swarmed the house, they searched it top to bottom, and in the garage, they found George's chemistry equipment. And nestled underneath it was a bottle that contained thallium. George would be found guilty of first-degree murder, as well as attempted murder on the rest of Peggy's family, and he would be sentenced to death. As of this episode, he is still alive, and he is still on death row. As for his wife Diana, who many people believe must have had something to do with the poisoning, or must have at least known it was happening, was never actually charged with anything. And so she would eventually divorce George and move on with her life and remarry. Some cases end with answers. Others end with more questions than anyone can ever fully explain. If you enjoyed this episode, drop your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget, you can find more true crime stories like this in the playlist waiting for you right now. See you in the next story.